It began not with thunder, but with movement, quiet, disciplined, deliberate. Columns of vehicles rolled along European roads at dawn, their engines low, their silhouettes sharp against mist and early light. To an untrained eye, they looked like any other armoured formation of the German army. But behind the steel, behind the insignia, behind the practiced coordination, stood something far more complex and far more troubling. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, known as Das Reich, was not just a fighting force. It was an expression of ideology made mobile, a division where military capability and political belief were fused into a single, dangerous instrument. From its earliest formation, Das Reich was shaped differently. Its officers were not chosen solely for tactical skill, but for loyalty. Its soldiers were taught not only how to fight, but what to believe. Training emphasized obedience over hesitation, commitment over doubt, and identity over individuality. The division was built to be dependable in combat, yes, but also uncompromising, rigid, and deeply entwined with the moral failures of the regime it served. In the early years of the war, Das Reich gained a reputation for effectiveness in Poland, in France. Later, in the brutal campaigns of the Eastern Front, its tanks advanced where others stalled. Its infantry held positions under extreme pressure. Its commanders demanded endurance without exception. But the same structure that produced battlefield cohesion also stripped away restraint, and as the war deepened, the line between soldier and executioner blurred beyond recognition. By the time Das Reich was withdrawn from the east and redeployed to France in 1944, it carried with it not only combat experience, but a long shadow of violence against civilians. The division moved west to refit and rearm just as the Allied invasion of Normandy loomed. Its units spread across southern and central France, resting, training, repairing vehicles, and enforcing control through fear. When the Allied landings began, Das Reich was ordered north. What followed was not a clean redeployment, it was a march marked by destruction. As the division moved toward Normandy, resistance activity increased. Roads were sabotaged, rail lines destroyed, communication disrupted, and in response, the division unleashed terror on the civilian population. Entire villages were punished, men were executed, homes were burned, and in places like Toula and Oradour-sur-Glane, the division committed atrocities that would forever define its name, acts carried out not in the fog of battle, but in cold reprisal against unarmed civilians. These crimes were not accidents. They were not the result of confusion. They were the consequence of ideology enforced without conscience. Yet the division continued to fight. In Normandy, Das Reich entered the hedgerows as a hardened, well-equipped armoured formation. It faced Allied air power that dominated the skies, artillery that pulverized positions without warning, and infantry units that adapted quickly to the brutal terrain. The hedgerows neutralized speed. The narrow lanes invited ambush. Every advance was costly. Tanks burned in sunken roads. Infantry fell in fields where visibility was measured in yards. The division fought with skill, but it fought a losing battle. As the Allies broke out of Normandy and surged across France, Das Reich retreated under constant pressure. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, air attacks shattered columns in daylight, command cohesion frayed, units were thrown into defensive battles that drained what remained of their strength. The division was pushed back toward the German border, leaving behind ruined towns, destroyed equipment, and a legacy that grew darker with every mile. During the Ardennes offensive, remnants of Das Reich were committed again, fighting in winter forests under conditions that stripped away even the illusion of control. Snow buried roads, engines froze, supplies vanished. The division attacked, defended, withdrew, not as the elite spearhead it once claimed to be, but as a battered force trying to survive a war that had already turned against it. By the final months of 1945, Das Reich was a shadow of its former self. Its tanks were few, its manpower depleted, its command structure fragmented. Some soldiers fought on out of fear, others out of indoctrination, others simply because surrender had not yet reached them as an option. When the division finally collapsed, it did so quietly, not with glory, not with vindication, but with exhaustion and defeat. And what remained afterward was not just wreckage. What remained were questions: how discipline becomes brutality, how belief overrides humanity, how competence in war does not absolve moral responsibility, how history must be examined, not admired. Tonight, we return to that story, not to praise, not to romanticize, but to understand. To trace how a division could be tactically capable and ethically catastrophic at the same time, to examine how ordinary men, shaped by training and ideology, became participants in extraordinary cruelty, to confront the uncomfortable truth that effectiveness in war does not equal honor. Before we continue, I want to ask you something quiet and personal, something grounded in this moment. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what hour has settled around you? Is it late where you are, calm and still, or is the day just beginning to fade? And something deeper, unique to this episode, the story of Das Reich reminds us how easily systems can push individuals beyond moral boundaries when obedience replaces reflection. In your own life, has there ever been a moment when you had to stop and question something that everyone around you accepted as normal? If you feel comfortable, share what that moment taught you. And if these long, reflective journeys into history help you slow your thoughts, settle your breathing, or drift toward rest, consider subscribing. October 10th, 1939, the Germania barracks in Hamburg. Paul Hauser stands in the cold rain, watching 3,000 men attempt a parade ground drill they've practiced for 6 weeks. They're out of step within 30 seconds. To his left, a young SS officer mutters that the Leibstandarte would have executed this flawlessly. Hauser says nothing, but his jaw tightens. He is 59 years old, a former lieutenant general of the Reichswehr, and he has been given an impossible task: transform political soldiers into a fighting division that the German army will respect. The men before him wear the same black uniforms as Hitler's bodyguard unit, but everyone knows they are second choice. They are the Leibstandarte's shadow. And shadows, Hauser thinks, watching another squad break formation, do not win wars. The division that would become Das Reich was born from failure and resentment. In October of 1939, Heinrich Himmler ordered the consolidation of 3 SS-Verfügungstruppe regiments, Deutschland, Germania, and Der Führer, into a single formation. On paper, this created a force of 18,438 men, larger than a standard Wehrmacht Panzer Division. In reality, it assembled a collection of parade ground soldiers who had spent more time guarding party rallies than studying infantry tactics. Only 23% of the officers had formal military academy training. The rest had risen through the SS based on political reliability and racial purity. When Hauser reviewed their personnel files, he found men who could recite Mein Kampf from memory but couldn't read a topographical map. The Wehrmacht generals knew this. They called the SSVT asphalt soldiers pretty for parades but useless in combat. Hauser had spent 30 years in the Imperial German Army and the Reichswehr. He had commanded battalions on the Western Front in the First World War. He knew what those generals were saying about him behind closed doors, that he had sold his professional soul for an SS rank and a pension. What drove a decorated officer to rehabilitate the military reputation of Heinrich Himmler's political militia? The answer lies in a meeting that took place in December of 1939 at the headquarters of OKH, the German Army High Command. Hauser was summoned to brief Wehrmacht planners on the SSVT's readiness for the coming offensive in the West. He entered a room full of generals he had once called colleagues. They did not rise when he entered. General Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, asked pointed questions about equipment, training standards, officer competency. Hauser answered each one honestly. When he finished, there was silence. Then a colonel whose name Hauser never learned said quietly, "Perhaps the SS should stick to what it does best, arresting Jews and guarding concentration camps." The room erupted in laughter. Hauser stood, gathered his papers, and walked out. He would remember every face in that room. He would make them regret their laughter. This was not about ideology for Hauser. This was about professional pride. The men Hauser had to work with came from across the greater German Reich. Regiment Deutschland drew heavily from Bavaria and Austria, men who spoke with thick southern accents. The Prussian drill instructors mocked. Regiment Germania recruited from the north, Hamburg and Bremen, urban workers who had joined the SS for steady pay during the Depression. Regiment Der Führer was the strangest. It accepted ethnic Germans from outside the Reich, Austrians before the Anschluss, Sudeten Germans from Czechoslovakia, even some Volksdeutsche from Romania and Hungary. These were men who had grown up speaking German but had never lived under German rule. They were proving their racial loyalty by volunteering to fight. The division was a sociological experiment as much as a military one. Could men from such different backgrounds forge unit cohesion? Could political indoctrination replace the institutional traditions that bound Wehrmacht formations together? In the autumn of 1939, as the regiments assembled in northern Germany, the answer appeared to be no. March of 1940. A training ground in Bavaria, 2 months before the invasion of France, Hosse had designed a live-fire exercise to test his officers under realistic conditions. The scenario was simple. A reinforced company would assault a fortified position using combined arms tactics while under artillery simulation. The company commander was an SS Hauptsturmführer named Nittel, 26 years old, a true believer who had joined the SS in 1933. He planned his attack by the book, Hause's book, the manual the general had personally written adapting Wehrmacht doctrine for SS units. The assault began at dawn. Within 20 minutes, everything went wrong. The artillery simulation, smoke generators and timed explosives created more confusion than the defenders' fire. Squads lost contact with their platoon leaders, the supporting machine gun section advanced too far and was caught in their own simulated barrage. And then the explosives, buried too shallow by the combat engineers, detonated prematurely. 12 men died instantly, another 8 were wounded, badly enough to require evacuation. Hosse shut down the exercise. He spent that night writing letters to the families of the dead, explaining that their sons had given their lives in training to prepare for the real battles ahead. He did not mention that they had died because his division was not ready. That truth he kept to himself. The catastrophe in Bavaria revealed a deeper problem. The SSVT was attempting to master in 6 months what Wehrmacht divisions learned over years of peacetime development. Hausse had the budget, Himmler ensured that, but money could not buy experience. The division received the latest equipment, modern artillery, anti-tank guns, even a small allocation of Panzer III and IV tanks for the reconnaissance battalion. But the crews did not know how to maintain them. Vehicles broke down during road marches. Artillery batteries could not establish firing solutions fast enough to support infantry attacks. The signals company could not keep radio communications functional across the dispersed regiment areas. Every exercise revealed new deficiencies, and time was running out. In April of 1940, Hausse received word that Vollgelb, the invasion of the West, would begin in early May. His division would be part of Army Group A, tasked with the decisive thrust through the Ardennes. He had 5 weeks to transform 18,000 political soldiers into a combat-effective force. It was impossible. He tried anyway. What Hausse did have was motivation. His men understood they were fighting not just the French and British, but the contempt of the German army. Every training iteration was conducted as if Wehrmacht observers were watching and sneering, which often they were. The OKH insisted on attaching liaison officers to SSVT units, officially to coordinate operations, actually to report on SS incompetence. These officers filed reports that circulated through the Wehrmacht officer corps. One report from March 1940 described an SS battalion's night navigation exercise where half the companies became lost and one platoon accidentally crossed into Belgium, requiring a diplomatic incident to retrieve them. Hausse was shown this report by a sympathetic Wehrmacht colonel who warned him that senior generals were lobbying Hitler to keep the SSVT out of frontline combat roles. The humiliation was deliberate. The Wehrmacht establishment wanted the SS to fail before the fighting even began. This created a dangerous psychology within the division, the need to prove themselves at any cost. The financial disparities made the resentment worse. While the SSVT struggled with insufficient training budgets, the Leibstandarte, Hitler's personal guard formation, received whatever they requested. Hausse learned that his division received 40% less funding per soldier than the Leibstandarte. When he protested to Himmler's staff, he was told that resources were allocated based on political importance. The Leibstandarte protected the Führer. The SSVT was a military experiment. If the experiment failed, it could be abandoned. Hausse understood the implication. His division was expendable. This knowledge filtered down through the officer corps to the enlisted men. They knew they were second class, even within the SS hierarchy. Some units adopted a bitter gallows humour. They called themselves the unwanted division, the formation nobody believed in. Others turned the rejection into aggressive determination. If the Wehrmacht and even the SS leadership expected failure, they would deliver success so overwhelming that it could not be denied. This mindset would define Das Reich throughout the war. It was born in contempt and raised on the need to prove itself. That hunger for validation would drive the division to extraordinary military achievements. It would also drive them to commit extraordinary crimes. April of 1940, Hitler visits the troops preparing for the Western offensive. His itinerary includes a review of the Leibstandarte, a full ceremonial inspection with speeches and decorations. The SSVT receives a 30-minute visit, no ceremony, no speeches. Hitler walks quickly past the assembled ranks, nods to Hauser, and departs. The contrast is intentional and humiliating. That evening, Hauser calls his regimental commanders together. He tells them the truth. The Wehrmacht does not want them in this battle. The OKH has lobbied to keep them in reserve, and only Hitler's personal intervention secured them a combat role. Their mission in the coming offensive is not just to defeat the enemy. It is to prove that the Waffen-SS deserves to exist. One of his colonels asks, what happens if they fail? Hauser's answer is simple. Then this division will be disbanded, and we will all go back to guarding train stations and government buildings. The officers leave that meeting understanding the stakes. This is an existential test. They must succeed or disappear into irrelevance. The division that assembled at the Belgian border in early May 1940 was not ready for war by Wehrmacht standards, but by the standards of what they had been 6 months earlier, they had achieved something remarkable. Hauser had imposed discipline through relentless drilling. He had personally fired 11 officers for incompetence and promoted junior leaders who showed tactical aptitude. He had simplified the Wehrmacht's complex doctrine into clear, repeatable procedures his men could execute under stress. Most importantly, he had given them a reason to fight that transcended ideology. They were not just serving Hitler or the Nazi state. They were proving that men the establishment had dismissed as political amateurs could become professional soldiers. This was Paul Hauser's calculated gamble. He had taken the SS's insecurity, its second-class status, and weaponized it into motivation. On May 10th, 1940, at 05:35, the invasion of the West began. The SSVT crossed into Belgium with the rest of Army Group A. Within hours, they would face their first test. The Wehrmacht generals who had mocked them were watching. The division that would become Das Reich was about to discover what it really was. In the cold, pre-dawn darkness, as the artillery barrage began and the first tanks rolled forward, Paul Hauser stood in his command vehicle and allowed himself a moment of doubt. Had he trained them well enough? Would they break under fire, like so many predicted? Or would they fight with the desperate courage of men who have everything to prove? Within 72 hours, he would have his answer. May 10th, 1940, 05:35. The Belgian border near Losheim. Unterscharführer Georg Frey crouches behind the lead armoured car of Regiment der Führer's reconnaissance company as the artillery barrage walks across the frontier posts ahead. He is 22 years old, from a village outside Munich, and this is the first time he has been shot at. The Belgian border guards fire back sporadically, their rifles cracking above the thunder of German guns. Frey's hands shake as he checks his MP-40 submachine gun. His section leader, a veteran of the Polish campaign, transferred from the Leibstandarte, notices and leans close. When we move, don't think. Just follow me and shoot at anything that isn't wearing field grey. At 05:40, the barrage lifts, the armoured cars surge forward. Frey runs behind them, his breath loud in his ears, certain he is about to die. He makes it 15 metres before a Belgian machine gun opens up from a concrete pillbox they had missed in the pre-assault reconnaissance. 2 men in front of him go down. The section leader is screaming to flank left. Frey runs toward the sound of the voice. This is how it begins. The SSVT's baptism of fire came not in the dramatic tank battles that propaganda would later celebrate, but in confused, small unit actions across the Belgian Ardennes. The division's 3 regiments entered the campaign with different missions. Regiment der Führer, Frey's unit, formed part of the reconnaissance screen for Guderian's Panzer Corps, tasked with identifying enemy strongpoints and bypassing resistance. Regiment Deutschland followed the main armoured thrust, providing infantry support to exploit breakthroughs. Regiment Germania was held in reserve, a disposition that infuriated its commander, who suspected the OKH still did not trust SS units in critical roles. In the first 72 hours of the campaign, De Führer advanced fastest, pushing 60 kilometres into Belgium against sporadic resistance. Deutschland encountered the first serious opposition near Sedan, where French colonial troops, Senegalese and Moroccan riflemen defended the Meuse River crossings with unexpected tenacity. Germania waited in traffic jams as the Wehrmacht's logistical system struggled to move hundreds of thousands of men through the narrow Ardennes roads. The division was experiencing war as it actually is, chaotic, improvised, and utterly unlike the training exercises. Sedan, May 13th, 1940. This is where the SSVT faced its first real test. The Wehrmacht's plan called for a rapid crossing of the Meuse River under air support, followed by an immediate breakout to trap French and British forces in Belgium. Regiment Deutschland drew the assignment of supporting the 7th Panzer Division's assault crossing. The attack began at midday with a Stuka bombardment that left the French defenders stunned but not broken. Deutschland's infantry loaded into assault boats and paddled across the river under machine gun fire. The crossing itself was successful. The holding of the far bank was not. French counterattacks, small but determined, pushed Deutschland's lead companies back to the water's edge. For 6 hours, the regiment clung to a bridgehead barely 300 metres deep. The regimental commander, Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner, committed his reserve battalion in a desperate gamble. They crossed under darkness, stumbled into a French strongpoint, and fought a close-range battle with grenades and bayonets. By dawn on May 14th, Deutschland held, but one battalion had taken 42% casualties, 73 men killed, 216 wounded, for a single kilometre of riverbank. What the SSVT learned at Sedan was that aggression without adequate preparation costs blood. Wehrmacht infantry divisions had trained for river crossings for years. They had specialised assault engineers, portable bridging equipment, and rehearsed procedures for suppressing enemy fire during vulnerable crossings. The SSVT had enthusiasm and ideological motivation. At Sedan, enthusiasm met reality. The casualty figures shocked Hauser. 42% losses in a single battalion exceeded the entire division's casualties in the Polish campaign. He visited the field hospitals and saw what modern combat did to human bodies. Men burned by flamethrowers, faces destroyed by shrapnel, legs amputated after crushing by collapsing buildings. These were not the clean, heroic deaths of propaganda. These were industrial-scale injuries inflicted by industrial-scale weaponry. And Sedan was considered a success. The bridgehead held, the Wehrmacht's panzers crossed and began their race to the Channel. But Hauser, walking among the wounded, began to understand the true cost of proving his division worthy. These men were paying the price of the Wehrmacht's skepticism with their bodies. The advance beyond Sedan revealed another pattern that would define Das Reich throughout the war. They pushed harder and faster than Wehrmacht units, given similar missions. On May 17th, Regiment de Führer received orders to secure a bridge over the Serre River as part of the pursuit of retreating French forces. The mission called for a reconnaissance in force to determine if the bridge was defended, then a decision whether to assault or bypass. The regiment's vanguard commander, an SS Sturmbannführer named Witt, interpreted these orders as permission to seize the bridge immediately. Without waiting for artillery support or even confirming the enemy's strength, Witt launched his motorcycle infantry straight at the bridge. French defenders were caught by surprise. The bridge fell in 20 minutes. Witt's battalion pushed across and advanced another 8 kilometres before nightfall, well beyond their assigned objectives. When Hauser learnt of this, he was simultaneously furious at the recklessness and impressed by the result. Witt had violated sound military practice. He had also achieved in one afternoon what would have taken a more cautious commander 2 days. The question was whether this kind of audacity was brilliance or madness. The answer, over the next 4 years, would be both. Montcornet, May 27th, 1940. Charles de Gaulle's hastily assembled armoured division launched a counterattack against the expanding German salient. The attack hit Regiment Deutschland's positions south of the town. The French had real tanks, Sharby 1S with heavy armour that German anti-tank guns could barely penetrate. Deutschland had almost no anti-tank capability. Their divisional artillery was still stuck in traffic jams 50 kilometres back. For the first time, the SSVT faced an enemy with material superiority. The French tanks rolled through Deutschland's forward positions, crushing machine gun nests, destroying bunkers. SS infantrymen found themselves fighting armour with rifles and grenades. Some panicked and fell back in disorder. Others held their positions and died. One company commander, an Austrian named Hamel, organised a suicidal close assault team. 6 men with magnetic mines and satchel charges. They crawled to within metres of the French tanks and attacked. 4 of the 6 were killed. They destroyed 2 tanks. It was not enough to stop the counterattack, but enough to slow it. By evening, Wehrmacht anti-tank units arrived and stabilised the line. De Gaulle's attack failed, but Deutschland had lost another 208 men Hauser later wrote in his diary, "We win by dying faster than the enemy can kill us. This is not sustainable." The pace of the advance became punishing. After the Meuse breakthrough, the SS-VT was committed to the exploitation phase, racing northwest to cut off Allied forces retreating toward Dunkirk. In 15 days, from May 14th to May 29th, the division advanced 420 kilometres. This required marching and fighting with almost no rest. Men slept in moving vehicles. Hot meals were impossible. Resupply convoys could not keep pace. Soldiers began to experience what Wehrmacht veterans called the grey exhaustion, a state beyond fatigue, where physical movement becomes automatic and thought slows to a crawl. Regiment Germania, finally committed to combat, marched 70 kilometres in 36 hours to reach the fighting around Lille. By the time they arrived, men were falling asleep while walking. Their first engagement was defending a village against a British counterattack. They won, but their reactions were slow, their fire discipline poor. 3 men died because they fell asleep on sentry duty and never saw the enemy approach. After the battle, the regimental commander assembled his officers and told them bluntly, "Exhaustion kills as surely as bullets. We must pace ourselves, or there will be no division left to fight." But there was no time to rest. The advance continued. The climax of the French campaign for the SSVT came not at Dunkirk but in the south, during the final drive toward the Loire River. After the northern pocket collapsed, the division was transferred to Army Group B for the push toward Paris and beyond. This is where they encountered the final, desperate French resistance. On June 19th, Regiment Deutschland approached the town of Tarare, southwest of Lyon. Intelligence reported that French forces were evacuating industrial equipment before the German arrival. Hauser ordered his reconnaissance battalion to seize the town before the French could complete the demolitions. The battalion arrived to find a chaotic scene. French army engineers trying to blow bridges, while civilian workers frantically loaded machinery onto trains. The SS troops stormed into the town, firing. The French engineers surrendered without destroying the bridges. The industrial facilities, machine tool factories producing precision parts for aircraft engines, fell into German hands intact. Their value was later assessed at 40 million Reichsmarks. Hauser received a commendation. The reconnaissance battalion received Iron Crosses. And in the confusion of the fighting, 23 Senegalese colonial troops who had surrendered were separated from the other prisoners. They were marched to a railway cutting outside town and machine-gunned. The incident appeared in after-action reports as 23 enemy killed in mopping-up operations. No investigation followed. The murder of the Senegalese prisoners at Tarare was not an isolated incident. Across the French campaign, SSVT units killed approximately 140 prisoners of war, mostly North African colonial troops. The killings were spontaneous, not ordered from division headquarters, but they followed a pattern. Colonial troops were seen as racial inferiors, coloured soldiers who did not deserve the protections of the Geneva Convention. Some SS men believed the propaganda they had been taught, that France's use of African troops proved the decadence and racial pollution of the enemy. Others killed out of revenge for casualties suffered, or simply because the prisoners were inconvenient and there was no one to stop them. In every case, the killings went unreported to higher Wehrmacht commands. The division's first war crimes were committed in an atmosphere of impunity. No one was punished. No one questioned the actions. The culture of the division was already diverging from Wehrmacht norms. Hauser knew. He read the after-action reports. He saw the burial details. He said nothing. His silence was a choice. The division that was proving itself militarily was simultaneously proving itself capable of casual atrocity. These two aspects of Das Reich's character were emerging together, inseparable from the beginning. By the end of June 1940, when France surrendered, the SSVT had transformed itself. It had entered the campaign as an untested formation that few believed in. It emerged with a combat record that even skeptical Wehrmacht generals had to acknowledge. The division had advanced 685 kilometres in 35 days. It had participated in every major phase of the campaign, from the Ardennes breakthrough to the final southern offensive. 7 of its officers received the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration. The casualty toll, 1,140 killed and 3,600 wounded, represented an 8% casualty rate, double the Wehrmacht average. But in the brutal calculus of military reputation, those casualties were the price of admission. The division had proven it could fight. It had proven it would pay in blood for success. And it had proven something darker. visible only to those who looked closely at the after-action reports. It would not allow humanitarian concerns to constrain its operations. The SSVT had passed its trial by fire. It would not remain the SSVT much longer. Within months, it would be redesignated the SS Division Reich. Within 2 years, Das Reich. But the essential character of the formation was already set, forged in the spring of 1940 in the forests of the Ardennes and the fields of France. It was a division that would stop at nothing to prove itself. Nothing. April 6th, 1941, Belgrade, 4:20 in the morning. The Luftwaffe's bombers arrive without warning, part of Operation Punishment. Hitler's rage-filled response to Yugoslavia's refusal to join the Axis. The SS Division Reich, recently redesignated from SSVT, is not part of the initial assault. They wait at the Hungarian border, engines idling, while Wehrmacht units pour into Yugoslavia from 3 directions. Major Franz Schönhuber, Wehrmacht liaison officer attached to Division Reich's headquarters, writes in his diary, "The SS men are restless, angry they're being held in reserve, while army units take the glory. Their entire identity is wrapped up in proving themselves. To be left out is torture." 2 days later, Division Reich crosses into Yugoslavia not as conquerors but as occupation troops tasked with securing rear areas. For a formation desperate to maintain its combat reputation, this feels like humiliation. That humiliation will have consequences. The Yugoslav campaign was supposed to be a brief interlude, a speed bump on the road to the real objective, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler had allocated 11 days for Yugoslavia to collapse. The assessment proved accurate. The Royal Yugoslav Army, torn by ethnic divisions and equipped with obsolete weapons, disintegrated under German assault. Croatia declared independence. Serbia sued for peace. By April 17th, organised resistance had ceased. Division Reich's role in this campaign was minimal by design. The OKH, still wary of SS reliability despite their performance in France, assigned them security duties in central Serbia. Their mission was to guard supply lines, process prisoners, and maintain order in occupied towns. This was police work, not combat. The division's officers seethed. Hauser protested to Himmler's headquarters, arguing that his division was being deliberately sidelined by jealous Wehrmacht generals. He was probably right, but the OKH's caution would prove prescient. Division Reich's brief time in Yugoslavia revealed what the formation became when given police powers instead of combat missions. April 11th, 1941, 7 kilometers south of Niš, on the road to Leskovac, a Division Reich supply column, 42 trucks carrying ammunition and fuel for the coming Soviet campaign, winds through rolling hills covered in oak forest. The convoy is escorted by 1 platoon of infantry, 42 men, commanded by an Oberscharführer named Koch. The ambush comes at 14:15. Yugoslav partisans, approximately 70 men, remnants of a collapsed army unit who had chosen to fight on open fire from both sides of the road. They have no heavy weapons, just rifles and a few machine guns, but they have the element of surprise. The lead truck explodes as an improvised mine detonates. The second truck crashes into it. Within seconds, the convoy is stopped, trapped on a narrow road with steep embankments on both sides. The partisan fire is accurate. 8 SS men die in the first minute. Another 14 are wounded. Koch tries to organise a defence, but there is no cover. The surviving Germans abandon the trucks and retreat back down the road on foot, carrying their wounded, leaving the burning convoy behind. The partisans fade into the forests with captured weapons and ammunition. It is Division Reich's first encounter with guerrilla warfare. They have been humiliated by an enemy they did not expect and cannot see. The response came within 24 hours. Hauser, receiving the report of the ambush, ordered the Divisional Reconnaissance Battalion to conduct retaliatory operations in the area. The order was vague: eliminate partisan elements and demonstrate the consequences of attacking German forces. The Reconnaissance Battalion commander, Major Otto Weidinger, interpreted this as permission for collective punishment. On April 14th, his units surrounded the village of Veliki Shiljegovac, population approximately 400, located 8 kilometers from the ambush site. There was no evidence linking the village to the partisan attack. Weidinger did not care. At 06:30, his troops entered the village, ordered all residents to assemble in the central square, and separated men from women and children. The men, 59 of them, were marched to a field outside the village and told they were hostages who would be released once the partisans surrendered. Instead, they were machine-gunned. The women and children were locked in the village church. The church was set on fire. 47 people died that morning, 34 men, 8 women, 5 children. The village itself was burned completely. Division Reich troops moved to the next village and repeated the process. By April 17th, 7 villages in the Niche region had been destroyed. Estimated civilian deaths, 234. The brutality of the reprisals shocked the Wehrmacht officers who witnessed them. Major Schönhuber, the liaison officer, filed a formal protest with Army Group South headquarters. His report described the massacres in clinical detail. SS troops showed no hesitation in executing women and children. Several men appeared to take pleasure in the violence. When I questioned a junior SS officer about the legality of these actions under international law, he laughed and said, "International law did not apply to bandits and Slavic subhumans." Schönhuber's report triggered a response from OKW, the Armed Forces High Command. On April 22, 1941, a directive was sent to all SS formations in Yugoslavia. Excessive force in anti-partisan operations was to be avoided. Reprisals must be proportional to attacks suffered, and civilians were not to be targeted without evidence of complicity. The directive was signed by Field Marshal Keitel himself. Hauser received the directive, noted it in his records, and filed it away. He made no attempt to discipline the officers involved in the massacres. When asked later why he had approved such extreme measures, Hauser responded with words that would define Division Reich's approach to irregular warfare. "The rules that govern conventional warfare do not apply when fighting partisans. Mercy is weakness. Hesitation invites further attacks. We responded with the only language these bandits understand: overwhelming violence." The psychological impact of the Yugoslav massacres on Division Reich soldiers is difficult to assess directly, but patterns emerge from the evidence. Of the approximately 300 men directly involved in the village burnings, most were young, under 25, with less than 2 years in the SS. They had joined seeking adventure and status. They had survived France and earned decorations. Now they were burning civilians alive in Balkan villages. Some men broke psychologically. Divisional medical records from April and May 1941 show a spike in soldiers reporting for psychological evaluation, severe nightmares, shaking hands, inability to eat. The division's doctors diagnosed these as cases of excessive sensitivity and recommended transfer to non-combat roles. Other soldiers appeared unaffected or even energized by the violence. Letters home, intercepted by German military censors, reveal a spectrum of responses. One soldier wrote to his wife, "We do what is necessary, though it is hard on the conscience. I pray this war ends soon." Another wrote to his brother, "You would not believe what we are capable of when unleashed. The enemy fears us now as they should." A third wrote to no one, keeping a diary later found in his effects after his death in Russia. "We have become something I do not recognize. Perhaps we always were this, and France simply did not reveal it." The division's time in Yugoslavia lasted only 23 days of active operations. In that brief window, they established patterns that would follow them for the rest of the war. First, a disproportionate response to any attack, measured not by military necessity but by the need to instill terror. Second, a complete disregard for the laws of war when dealing with partisans or civilians suspected of supporting them. Third, a ratio of reprisal killing that far exceeded Wehrmacht norms. Division Reich killed approximately 7 civilians for every German casualty suffered in partisan attacks, compared to the Wehrmacht average of roughly 3 to 1. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the division's leadership actively encouraged this brutality. Hauser's refusal to punish the village burnings sent a clear message to his subordinates: ruthlessness would be rewarded, or at least tolerated. Mercy would be seen as weakness. This was not the result of individual soldiers losing control in the heat of combat. This was institutional culture being shaped from the top down. One Wehrmacht officer who observed Division Reich in Yugoslavia later testified at the Nuremberg trials. His name was Hauptmann Erich von dem Bach-Zalewski, and though he would later become a war criminal himself, his assessment of what he saw in April 1941 is historically valuable. The SS division was different from Wehrmacht units I had served with. They viewed the civilian population not as unfortunate bystanders to be protected where possible, but as the enemy themselves. Every Serbian was a potential partisan. every village a potential ambush site. This mentality led them to preemptive violence. They did not wait to be attacked and then respond. They attacked first, assuming guilt, and forced the population to prove innocence, which, of course, was impossible. You cannot prove you are not a partisan to men who have already decided to kill you. Buczylewski's testimony captures the essential problem. Division Reich had entered Yugoslavia expecting another France, another conventional campaign where their aggressive tactics would earn glory. Instead, they found a different kind of war, one where the enemy wore no uniform and hid among civilians. Their response was not to adapt their tactics but to redefine the enemy as the entire population. By late April 1941, Division Reich was pulled out of Yugoslavia and sent north to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. They left behind burned villages, mass graves, and a Serbian population that would remember. The partisan resistance in Yugoslavia would grow throughout the war, eventually tying down entire German divisions in brutal anti-guerrilla campaigns. Division Reich's brutality in April 1941 did not suppress resistance. It guaranteed that resistance would intensify. But the division's leadership learned the wrong lesson. They concluded that they had not been brutal enough, that decisive terror must be applied faster and more comprehensively. This is what they would bring to the Soviet Union. The Yugoslav interlude was brief, almost a footnote in most histories of Division Reich, but it was the bridge between France, where the division proved it could fight, and Russia, where it would prove it could commit atrocity at industrial scale. In Yugoslavia, Division Reich discovered that it could massacre civilians and face no consequences. That discovery would shape everything that followed. On April 25th, 1941, the division crossed back into German-occupied territory. Behind them, smoke still rose from the villages they had destroyed. Ahead of them lay the vastness of the Soviet Union and the opportunity to apply the lessons they had learnt. History would judge those lessons harshly. But history would not write its verdict for decades. For now, Division Reich was simply a formation that had successfully completed its security mission and was ready for the next campaign. The men who had burned Veliki Shiljagovac cleaned their weapons, wrote letters home, and prepared to invade Russia. Some slept soundly, some did not. All moved forward. June 22nd, 1941, 0315, the Bug River, German-Soviet demarcation line. Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt lies in tall grass on the western bank, watching the Soviet frontier posts through binoculars. He can see sentries smoking cigarettes, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. They have no idea what is coming. Schmidt is a gunner in Division Reich's assault gun battalion, and his crew has been in position for 6 hours, waiting. The order comes at 0314, 1 minute to hour. Schmidt climbs into his Stug 3 assault gun, settles into the gunner's seat, and loads high explosive. At 0315, precisely, 3,000 German guns open fire along an 1,100-kilometre front. The Soviet positions across the river disappear in fire and smoke. Schmidt's assault gun lurches forward, heading for the bridge his platoon is tasked to seize. He has been told this campaign will last 6 weeks. He will still be fighting 6 months from now, frozen in the snow outside Moscow. If he survives that long, Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in human history. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, supported by 3,000 aircraft, crashed into Soviet defences along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Division Reich formed part of Army Group Center, the formation tasked with a direct thrust toward Moscow along the Minsk-Smolensk highway. The division's mission was to support Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, providing infantry to consolidate breakthroughs and eliminate Soviet pockets bypassed by the fast-moving armour. This was the role Division Reich had trained for: exploitation warfare, rapid advances, aggressive pursuit of a collapsing enemy. The first 3 weeks seemed to confirm that the campaign would unfold as planned. Soviet units surrendered en masse, entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Division Reich advanced 300 kilometres in 16 days, averaging 19 kilometres per day. The soldiers wrote letters home describing easy victories and demoralised Soviet prisoners. The mood was triumphant, Moscow seemed within reach, and then everything began to slow down. Yelnya. That single word would haunt Division Reich veterans for the rest of their lives. The Yelnya salient was a bulge in the German lines, 60 kilometres southeast of Smolensk, where aggressive advances had pushed deep into Soviet territory. In early July 1941, Division Reich was ordered to capture the town of Yelnya and hold it as a jumping-off point for the final drive on Moscow. The town itself fell easily on July 9th. Holding it became a nightmare. The Soviets had chosen Yelnya as the place to make a stand. They poured reinforcements into the sector, fresh divisions from the Far East, 34 tanks, artillery and concentrations the Germans had not yet encountered. Division Reich found itself holding an exposed salient under constant attack from three sides. The fighting was close range, brutal, and continuous. Soviet infantry assaulted German positions night after night. German counter-barrage fire exhausted ammunition stocks. Casualties mounted at a rate that shocked division staff. In the first week at Yelnya, 2,400 men were killed or wounded. The division's effective combat strength, which had been approximately 17,000 at the start of Barbarossa, fell below 13,000. Still, the orders were to hold. July 16th, 1941, a company of Regiment Deutschland defending a collective farm outside Yelnya. The company numbered 140 men when they took the position 5 days earlier. Now they number 68. The wounded have been evacuated, but the dead lie where they fell, because there is no time for burial details. The company commander, Hauptsturmführer Werner Wolf, is 28 years old and aging visibly. He has not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the battle began. At 2200 hours, the Soviets attack again. Wolf can hear them coming, thousands of voices shouting "Ura" as they charge across open ground. His company opens fire with every weapon they have. The attack collapses 50 meters from the German line. An hour later, it comes again, and again at midnight, and again at 0200. Wolf writes in his diary, found later in the ruins, "We are killing them faster than they can run at us, and still they come. Where are all these soldiers coming from? We were told the Red Army was destroyed. These men have not received that message." The battle for Yelnya revealed the first great miscalculation of Barbarossa. German intelligence had estimated the Soviet Union could field 200 divisions. By August 1941, the Wehrmacht had identified and engaged over 360 divisions, with more appearing every week. The endless reserves of Soviet manpower became psychologically devastating for German soldiers who had been promised a quick victory. At Yelnya, Division Reich faced not just material attrition but the realization that this would not be France. Every position captured had to be held against counterattacks. Every Soviet unit destroyed was replaced by another. The division's casualty rate, 8% in France over 6 weeks, reached 30% at Yelnya in less than a month. By August 1st, 1941, the division had lost 5,200 men, killed, wounded, or missing. That represented nearly 1/3 of its combat strength. The replacements arriving from Germany were poorly trained, often pulled from other branches of service with minimal infantry experience. The division that held Yelnya in August was qualitatively different from the one that had crossed the Bug in June. It was bleeding out. The broader strategic situation deteriorated even as Division Reich fought its isolated battle. Army Group Center's advance stalled across the entire front as Hitler diverted forces to encircle Leningrad in the north and Kiev in the south. Moscow, the original objective, receded into the distance. Logistics became catastrophic. The German supply system had been designed for a 6-week campaign ending before winter. Now, in August, with the campaign clearly extending into autumn at minimum, the Wehrmacht found itself hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory with inadequate transportation to bring forward fuel, ammunition, food, or winter clothing. Division Reich's quartermaster reported in late August that the division was receiving 40% of its required daily supplies. Soldiers supplemented rations by looting Soviet farms and villages. Vehicles broke down and could not be repaired for lack of spare parts. The ammunition shortage became so acute that artillery batteries were rationed to 5 shells per gun per day, making effective fire support impossible. The division was winning tactical engagements while losing the logistical war. September 6th, 1941, Division Reich was finally pulled out of the Yelnya salient, replaced by fresh Wehrmacht divisions. The relief was merciful. The salient was abandoned days later as the Soviets launched a major counteroffensive that recaptured Yelnya and pushed the Germans back 30 kilometers. Division Reich had held that blood-soaked ground for nearly 2 months. 4,200 men had been killed or wounded defending it, and for what? The salient was given up without strategic consequence. Survivors of the Yelnya battle would later describe it as the moment they stopped believing in quick victory. Gefreiter Otto Kumm, who would rise to command the division later in the war, wrote, "Yelnya taught us we were in a war of extermination. The Soviets would trade 10 lives for 1 German and consider it a bargain. We could win every battle and still lose because we would run out of men first." This was the psychological watershed. The invincible division that had conquered France now understood it could be destroyed. October 1941, Operation Typhoon, the final push for Moscow, began with renewed optimism. Army Group Center, reinforced and rested, launched a massive offensive aimed at encircling and destroying the Soviet forces defending the capital. Division Reich, brought back up to strength with replacements, participated in the initial breakthrough. The advance was spectacular. Within 2 weeks, German panzers had torn holes in Soviet defenses and encircled 600,000 Red Army soldiers near Vyazma. The road to Moscow seemed open. Division Reich's reconnaissance elements pushed to within 120 kilometers of the city. On October 12th, forward observers with powerful optics reported they could see the spires of the Kremlin through the autumn haze. It was the closest the division would ever come. Then the weather changed. Rain turned roads to mud. Vehicles bogged down. The advance slowed to a crawl. And as October turned to November, the rain became sleet, and the sleet became snow. The Russian winter arrived early. The cold came as a shock because the Wehrmacht had made no preparation for it. Winter uniforms had not been distributed because the campaign was supposed to be over by October. Division Reich soldiers fought in the same summer field uniforms they had worn in June. Temperatures dropped to -10 Celsius in early November, -20 by late November, -30 by December. Men improvised cold weather gear by looting Soviet positions. Felt boots, padded jackets, fur hats. These were not enough. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties by mid-November. Weapons froze. Machine guns stopped firing because the oil in their mechanisms congealed. Rifles had to be thawed over fires before they could be loaded. Tank engines refused to start unless crews lit fires beneath them, a process that took hours and revealed positions to Soviet artillery. The Wehrmacht, the most mechanized army in the world, was reduced to immobility by weather. Division Reich watched its combat effectiveness evaporate, not from Soviet action, but from cold. Outside Istra, November 7th, 1941, temperature -28 Celsius. Regiment Germania holds a defensive line along a frozen stream. The regimental medical officer, a doctor named Schreiber, conducts evening sick call and is horrified by what he sees. 37 men report frostbite severe enough to require evacuation. Another 60 have first-degree frostbite that will worsen without treatment. The regiment has no heated shelters, no medical supplies designed for cold injuries, nothing. Schreiber does what he can. He packs the worst cases into a truck and sends them to a field hospital 40 kilometers to the rear. The truck breaks down halfway. 8 men die of exposure before the truck is repaired. Schreiber sits in his frozen aid station and writes a report to Division Medical Headquarters. "We are losing more men to the cold than to the enemy. If winter uniforms are not distributed immediately, this division will cease to exist by January." The report goes up the chain of command. Nothing changes. The winter uniforms are stuck in supply depots in Poland, awaiting transportation that does not exist. December 5th, 1941. The Soviet counteroffensive began along the entire Moscow front. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for winter and held in reserve, specifically for this moment, crashed into the exhausted German lines. Division Reich, holding positions outside Istra, was hit by 3 Soviet divisions attacking simultaneously. The Germans had no reserves, no ability to maneuver in the deep snow, no way to stop the assault. The line broke. For the first time in the war, Division Reich retreated under fire. It was chaotic. Units lost contact with each other in blizzard conditions. Vehicles were abandoned when they ran out of fuel or broke down. Wounded men were left behind because there was no way to carry them through the snow. The division fell back 60 kilometers in 5 days, fighting rearguard actions at every village, leaving a trail of destroyed equipment and frozen corpses. The retreat from Moscow broke something fundamental in the division's psychology. They had believed themselves unbeatable. Now they were running. By December 31st, 1941, when the retreat stabilized and Division Reich established a defensive line west of Rzhev, the accounting was brutal. The division had suffered 10,690 casualties since June 22nd. 4,120 killed or missing, 6,000 570 wounded. That represented 60% of the division's initial strength. Some battalions were reduced to company size. Every original company commander was dead, wounded, or evacuated with frostbite. The division that had entered the Soviet Union as an elite formation was now a shell, held together by junior officers promoted in the field and soldiers too stubborn or too frightened to quit. Hauser, surveying his shattered command, requested permission to withdraw the division to Germany for reconstitution. Permission was denied. Division Reich would hold the line through the winter, and as the soldiers dug frozen earth to create bunkers and burned furniture from abandoned Russian homes just to survive temperatures that reached -40°C, they understood that the war had fundamentally changed. This was no longer about conquest or glory. This was about survival. Moscow had broken. Division Reich. What emerged from that winter would be something different, something harder, something that had stared into the abyss and learned to stare back. The division would recover. It would fight again, but it would never again be the formation that had crossed the Bug River on that June morning, believing in inevitable victory. That belief died in the snow outside Moscow. What replaced it was darker and more dangerous. January 1942, a military hospital in Dresden. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich lies in a clean bed for the first time in 7 months, staring at his hands. They are wrapped in bandages, healing from second-degree frostbite that cost him 3 fingers on his left hand. He is 24 years old, a veteran of France and the Moscow offensive with Regiment Deutschland. 2 beds over, another Division Reich soldier screams in his sleep, reliving the retreat. The nurse comes to administer sedatives. She does this every night. Dietrich asks her how many Division Reich men are in this hospital. She tells him 143, spread across 4 wards. Frostbite, trench foot, combat wounds, psychological collapse. She has seen them arrive in waves since December. What happened to you out there, she asks. Dietrich does not answer because he does not have words for it. How do you explain watching your battalion die, not in glorious combat but frozen to death in the snow? How do you explain executing Soviet prisoners because feeding them was impossible and releasing them was unthinkable? He turns his face to the wall. In 2 months, he will be declared fit for duty and sent to France to rejoin the division. He will not be the same man. None of them will be. The reconstitution of Division Reich took place far from the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, in the pleasant countryside of southern France. The decision to rebuild the division in France rather than Germany was practical. Southern France was garrisoned by second-line troops, and the growing French resistance made a first-rate combat division useful for security operations. But the decision was also symbolic. The division that had proven itself in France in 1940 would be reborn there. Between January and June of 1942, the remnants of Division Reich, approximately 3,000 combat effectives and 2,000 support personnel, withdrew from the Eastern Front in stages and assembled at training areas around the town of Croix-de-Guerre. The gaps in the ranks were stark. Regiment Deutschland had entered Russia with 3,200 men. It returned with 480, 3,000 men in, 530 out. 3,100 in, 620 out. The division that had fielded over 18,000 men in June 1941 now counted barely 5,000. The reconstitution would require more than replacements. It would require rebuilding from the ground up. The replacement troops arrived throughout the spring of 1942. 7,800 men pulled from SS training depots across Germany and occupied Europe. The demographic shift was dramatic. The original Division Reich had averaged 26.1 years of age, with many veterans of civilian careers before joining the SS. The replacements averaged 19.3 years old. Most had joined the Waffen-SS directly from the Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, the Nazi Party's youth organization. They had spent their teenage years in ideological indoctrination camps, learning racial theory and worship of the Führer. They had no adult memory of life before National Socialism. Their military training was competent but narrow, focused on small unit tactics and political reliability rather than the broader operational understanding the Wehrmacht emphasized. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were ideological warriors who happened to have military training. The veterans returning from Russia, scarred and cynical, found themselves surrounded by true believers who still spouted the propaganda the veterans had stopped believing in. May 20th, 1942. The training area at Croix-de-Guerre, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, has come to personally address the reconstituted division. He stands before 12,000 men, the rebuilt Division Reich, now expanded beyond its original size. Himmler is not an imposing figure physically, but his words carry the weight of absolute authority. He speaks for 90 minutes. He does not discuss tactics or strategy. He discusses race. You are the vanguard of a racial struggle that will determine the fate of Europe for 1,000 years, Himmler tells them. The enemy you face is not merely a military opponent, but a biological threat to the German people. The Slavic hordes, the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, the degenerate democracies of the West, all must be destroyed utterly. This is not conventional war. This is a war of annihilation. And you must steel yourselves to do what is necessary without mercy, without hesitation, without the weakness of humanitarian sentiment. The young soldiers cheer. The veterans stand silent. Hauptsturmführer Werner Wolf, survivor of Yelnya, writes in his diary that night, "The Reichsführer speaks of annihilation. We have seen annihilation. We have become it. He asks us to go further. I wonder if there is a further left, or if we have already crossed every line." The reconstitution involved more than personnel. Division Reich was redesignated SS Panzer Division Das Reich in January 1942, a title change that reflected both its elite status and its mechanization. The division received a full complement of modern equipment: new trucks, half-tracks, armoured personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery. An entire panzer battalion was attached, equipped with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. This mechanization made Das Reich one of the most mobile formations in the entire Wehrmacht, capable of sustained offensive operations at a pace infantry divisions could not match. The new equipment came with new doctrine. Das Reich would no longer be a standard infantry division supporting panzer breakthroughs. It would be a self-contained, combined arms formation capable of independent operations. This transformation was part of Himmler's larger vision, to build a Waffen-SS that could rival the Wehrmacht, not just in combat effectiveness, but in prestige and autonomy. Das Reich was his showcase. Everything it received, the latest equipment, the best replacements, the personal attention of senior SS leadership, was calibrated to make it succeed. But the reconstitution also involved something darker, a systematic increase in ideological indoctrination. Political instruction time, the hours devoted each week to Nazi racial theory and party doctrine, increased from 2 hours per week to 6. Each battalion received a dedicated SS ideological officer, a position that did not exist in Wehrmacht formations. These officers did not command troops. Their job was to ensure political reliability, to identify and remove soldiers showing insufficient commitment to Nazi ideology, and to frame all military operations in explicit racial terms. The lectures they gave reduced complex military and political situations to simple racial binaries: German versus Slav, Aryan versus Jew, civilization versus barbarism. For the young replacements, this indoctrination reinforced what they had already learned in the Hitlerjugend. For the veterans, it was an unwelcome intrusion of politics into military affairs. But the veterans were now the minority. By June 1942, only 11% of Das Reich's personnel had served with the division before Barbarossa. The institutional memory of France, of Yugoslavia, even of Moscow, was fading. The division was being remade in the image Himmler wanted: politically fanatical, racially motivated, and unrestrained by traditional military ethics. The first test of this reconstituted division came not on a battlefield but in the villages of southern France. By summer of 1942, the French resistance had begun organised operations against German occupation forces. Acts of sabotage, assassinations of collaborators, attacks on isolated German units. The resistance in southern France was still nascent, poorly armed and loosely coordinated, but it was growing. Das Reich was assigned to conduct anti-partisan operations, euphemistically called security missions, to suppress this resistance. The tactics the division employed were imported directly from Yugoslavia and Russia: collective punishment, hostage-taking, reprisal executions at ratios far exceeding the losses suffered. Between June and October 1942, Das Reich conducted 43 anti-partisan sweeps in the regions around Montpellier, Toulouse, and Bordeaux. These operations resulted in 167 resistance fighters killed or captured. They also resulted in over 400 civilian deaths. Villages suspected of harbouring resistance were surrounded, searched, and if weapons were found, or sometimes simply on suspicion, the male inhabitants were executed. The brutality was deliberate. The goal was not just to eliminate resistance but to terrorize the population into submission. July 14th, 1942, Bastille Day. The village of St. Colombe, in the Tarn region. A Wehrmacht patrol was ambushed near the village 2 days earlier. One German soldier killed. The resistance fighters escaped. Das Reich's security battalion surrounds St. Colombe at dawn. They have no evidence the village was involved in the ambush beyond geographic proximity. The battalion commander orders the village searched. No weapons are found. No resistance members identified. The commander, acting on the doctrine of collective responsibility, orders 23 men selected at random from the village population and shot in the town square. The women and children are forced to watch. The bodies are left on display for 48 hours. A sign is placed. This is the fate of those who support bandits and terrorists. The battalion moves to the next village on their sweep. The officer who ordered the executions receives no reprimand. In his after-action report, he notes, "The population now understands the consequences of supporting illegal armed groups. Further incidents in this sector are unlikely." He is wrong. The massacre at St. Colombe creates dozens of new resistance recruits. But this is a lesson Das Reich never learns. They believe terror works because they measure success by immediate compliance, not long-term consequence. The psychological transformation of Das Reich during the reconstitution period is visible in the personal documents soldiers left behind. Letters home, diaries, official reports all show a hardening of attitudes towards civilians and enemies. The veterans of Moscow wrote with a grim fatalism. They had survived hell and expected to return to it. The young replacements wrote with a disturbing enthusiasm. They were eager to prove themselves, to participate in the great racial struggle they had been told about their entire lives. One 19-year-old recruit wrote to his father in August 1942, "We are training for our return to the East. I know we will face hardships, but I am ready to sacrifice everything for the Führer and the fatherland. The Jews and Bolsheviks have brought this war upon us, and we will ensure they pay the price. I am proud to serve in Das Reich, a division known for its hardness and refusal to compromise. The language of compromise as weakness, of hardness as virtue, of the enemy as less than human. These were the concepts being systematically installed in the division's culture. By October 1942, as Das Reich prepared to return to the Eastern Front, it was no longer the formation that had retreated from Moscow. It was younger, more fanatical, more thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology, and increasingly disconnected from the restraints that traditionally governed military conduct. The senior leadership of Das Reich changed during the reconstitution. Paul Hauser, now promoted to command the entire SS Panzer Corps, departed in October 1942. His replacement was SS Gruppenführer Herbert Wahl, a career SS officer with extensive Eastern Front experience, but no service with the division. Wahl's appointment signalled Himmler's priorities. He wanted commanders who would implement SS ideological goals without the hesitations of officers with Wehrmacht backgrounds. Wahl made his expectations clear in his first address to division officers. This division exists to destroy the racial enemies of Germany. We fight not for territory or resources, but for the biological survival of our people. Every operation, every action, every decision you make must be viewed through this lens. Weakness, mercy toward the enemy, adherence to obsolete notions of military honour, these are luxuries we cannot afford. We are the tip of the spear in a race war. Act accordingly. The officers who heard this speech reacted in different ways. Some embraced it as validation of what they already believed. Others were troubled but remained silent. And a very few, began to quietly request transfers to other units. Most of these requests were denied. By December 1942, Das Reich was ready to return to the Eastern Front. The division now numbered 20,000 men, the largest it had ever been. It was fully mechanized, well-equipped, and extensively trained. On paper, it was one of the most formidable formations in the German military. But it was also something else. It was a division that had been systematically shaped to commit atrocity. The veterans of Moscow had learned that survival required brutality. The young replacements had been taught that brutality was ideological virtue. The leadership had been selected for willingness to apply violence without restraint, and the division's experience in Yugoslavia and southern France had demonstrated that such violence, when unpunished, even rewarded. Das Reich was returning to the East as a weapon designed not just for military victory but for racial warfare. The consequences would unfold over the next 2 years in Ukraine, in Russia, in Poland, in villages whose names became synonymous with massacre. The Reconstitution of 1942 did not just rebuild Das Reich. It radicalized it, purified it of whatever restraints had remained, and pointed it back toward the Eastern Front with the implicit message that nothing, no law, no convention, no humanitarian concern would limit what it was permitted to do. The division that retreated from Moscow had been defeated but retained some connection to military tradition. The division that returned was something new, something darker, something that would leave a trail of devastation across Eastern Europe that would still be remembered 80 years later. In the pleasant countryside of southern France, surrounded by vineyards and medieval villages, Das Reich had become what Himmler had always intended, not soldiers, but instruments of annihilation. February 10th, 1943, Kharkov, Ukraine's second largest city, industrial center, strategic linchpin of the southern front. Obergefreiter Thomas Klein crouches behind a 34 tank, knocked out and abandoned by retreating Soviet forces 3 days earlier. He is a gunner in Das Reich's newly formed Panzer Battalion, and his tank is somewhere behind him in the smoking ruins of the city's factory district. The Soviets retook Kharkov on February 16th, pushing German forces out in a humiliating withdrawal. Now, less than a month later, Das Reich is part of Field Marshal von Manstein's counterattack, his famous backhand blow designed to recapture the city and stabilize the entire southern sector. Klein watches Soviet infantry moving between buildings 400 meters ahead. His platoon commander is calling in artillery. The radio crackles with traffic from a dozen units, all converging on the city center. This is not the fluid warfare of France or the frozen misery of Moscow. This is urban combat. Close, brutal, building by building. Klein checks his ammunition. He has 4 magazines left. He's been in combat for 8 hours. It feels like 8 days. The artillery starts falling. Klein runs forward. The Third Battle of Kharkov represented Das Reich's return to prominence after the disaster of Moscow. The battle showcased the division's transformation into a mechanized formation capable of independent offensive operations. Das Reich entered the battle on March 7th, 1943, as part of SS Panzer Corps, alongside the Leibstandart and Totenkopf divisions. Their mission was to recapture Kharkov from Soviet forces that had overextended themselves in the post-Stalingrad offensives. The German counterattack was a masterpiece of operational art. Manstein had allowed the Soviets to advance deep into German-held territory, stretching their supply lines, then struck at their flanks with concentrated panzer forces. Das Reich approached Kharkov from the northwest, cutting off Soviet retreat routes, while other German formations applied pressure from multiple directions. The battle lasted 9 days. It was a German victory that temporarily stabilized the Eastern Front and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could still win major engagements. It also demonstrated that Das Reich could win them while simultaneously committing systematic war crimes in the areas they captured. March 11th, 1943. The industrial district of Kharkov, a maze of factories, warehouses, and workers' housing. Das Reich's Panzer Grenadiers fight their way through this terrain against determined Soviet defenders. The Red Army had fortified the factories, turning them into strong points bristling with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Das Reich's solution was methodical destruction. Combat engineers moved building to building with explosive charges, blowing holes in walls to allow infantry to advance under cover. When Soviet defenders held out in bunkers or reinforced positions, flamethrower teams incinerated them. The division's pioneer battalion became expert in urban warfare, developing techniques that would later be studied by military theorists. But the pioneers did not distinguish between military and civilian structures. If a building offered cover to Soviet troops, it was destroyed. If civilians were inside, they died. The battle for the industrial districts left approximately 2,000 Soviet soldiers dead and an estimated 800 civilians killed in the crossfire or burned alive in buildings that became infernos. Das Reich's after-action reports meticulously documented enemy casualties and buildings destroyed. Civilian deaths were not mentioned. The recapture of Kharkov cost Das Reich 1,100 killed and 3,400 wounded, an 11% casualty rate in 9 days of fighting. But the division inflicted disproportionate losses on Soviet forces, estimated 15,000 killed, 23,000 captured. The kill ratio, the metric by which German commanders measured effectiveness, was favourable. Das Reich had proven itself again. Knight's Crosses were awarded. The division was praised in Wehrmacht communiques as exemplifying the offensive spirit and tactical excellence of German arms. What the communiques did not mention was what happened after the combat ended. Between March 20th and March 26th, as Das Reich transitioned from combat operations to occupation duties in captured territories, divisional security units conducted anti-partisan sweeps in villages around Kharkov. These operations resulted in 1,200 civilians executed, accused of partisan activity or supporting partisans. The accusations were rarely supported by evidence. In many cases, the definition of partisan supporter was simply being a male of military age. The pattern from Yugoslavia and France was repeating at larger scale. Combat effectiveness and criminality were not separate aspects of Das Reich. They were two sides of the same institutional culture. March 15th, 1943, the center of Kharkov, where Wehrmacht and SS units fight house to house against Soviet defenders who refuse to surrender. Das Reich's Regiment der Führer is tasked with clearing a 6-block area of apartment buildings. The Soviets have fortified individual apartments, turning them into firing positions with interlocking fields of fire. Der Führer's commander decides that clearing each apartment individually will take too long and cost too many casualties. Instead, he orders his pioneer company to systematically demolish the buildings using explosive charges and incendiaries. The regiment establishes a cordon, preventing anyone from leaving the target area, then begins the demolition. The buildings are occupied. Approximately 200 Soviet soldiers are inside, along with an unknown number of civilians who had not evacuated when the fighting started. Over 48 hours, the buildings are reduced to rubble. Everything inside dies. Some are crushed by collapsing structures, others burned to death. Some Soviet soldiers attempt to break out and are machine gunned as they emerge. When the demolition is complete, Das Reich moves forward and occupies the ruins. The regimental report notes, sector cleared, enemy resistance eliminated. Our casualties, 3 killed, 14 wounded. The efficiency is praised, the methods are not questioned. The spring of 1943 brought a brief operational pause after Kharkov. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud that turned unpaved Russian roads into impassable swamps, made large-scale operations impossible. Das Reich used this time to absorb replacements, repair equipment, and train for the coming summer offensive. That offensive would be Operation Citadel, the assault on the Kursk salient, the largest tank battle in history. Das Reich would be at the center of it. The division's panzer strength had grown significantly. 211 tanks, including 45 new Panther tanks and 35 Tiger heavy tanks. The Panthers were Germany's answer to the Soviet 34, mounting a long-barreled 75mm gun and sloped armor. The Tigers were mobile fortresses, nearly impervious to standard anti-tank weapons. On paper, Das Reich possessed overwhelming armoured firepower. The problem was reliability. The Panthers were rushed into service without adequate testing. Their engines overheated. Their transmissions failed. Of the 45 Panthers assigned to Das Reich in June 1943, only 18 would be operational by the time Citadel began, July 5, 1943, 0430. The Kursk salient. Das Reich's panzers moved forward in the pre-dawn darkness, part of a massive assault involving over 2,000 German tanks and assault guns. Operation Citadel aims to pinch off the Kursk salient by attacking simultaneously from north and south, encircling and destroying the Soviet forces inside. Das Reich attacks from the south as part of 4th Panzer Army, tasked with breaking through Soviet defences and driving north toward Kursk. The attack begins with an artillery barrage that lights the horizon. Then the panzers advance. They immediately run into the most extensive defensive preparations in military history. The Soviets have had months to fortify Kursk. They have laid over 1 million mines, dug 3 defensive lines each kilometres deep, and positioned thousands of anti-tank guns and dug-in tanks as fortified firing points. Das Reich's advance covers 4 kilometres on the first day. The cost is 17, Panthers broken down, 14 other tanks destroyed by mines or anti-tank fire, and 320 men killed or wounded. This is day 1. The battle will last 12 days. The fighting at Kursk was attritional warfare at industrial scale. Das Reich attacked the same Soviet positions day after day, taking casualties, withdrawing, regrouping, attacking again. The division's tank strength degraded steadily, 46 panzers destroyed, 70 damaged and under repair. The replacement rate could not keep pace with losses. Infantry battalions that entered Citadel at full strength fell to 50% in a week. The Soviets were losing more, much more, but they had more to lose. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every defensive line breached, another line waited behind it. Das Reich's soldiers, veterans of France and Moscow and Kharkov, began to realize they were participating in a battle that could not be won. The division was being ground down against defenses that absorbed punishment and did not break. This was the new reality of the Eastern Front. German tactical superiority no longer guaranteed victory. Soviet material superiority and willingness to accept catastrophic losses guaranteed stalemate. July 12, 1943, Prokhorovka. This single day would enter military history as the largest tank battle ever fought. Approximately 800 German tanks, including Das Reich's remaining panzers, clashed with over 800 Soviet tanks in a 4-kilometer-wide battlefield. The fighting was so close that standard tactics became impossible. Tanks fired at ranges of 50 meters. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, as smoke from burning vehicles and churned-up dust created an artificial fog. Das Reich's Tigers and Panthers had advantages in firepower and armor, but in close-range brawling, those advantages diminished. Soviet 34s and KV heavy tanks swarmed the German formations, accepting losses to get close enough to penetrate even Tiger armor. The battle lasted 12 hours. At the end, Das Reich had lost 46 panzers destroyed and 70 damaged. Soviet losses were approximately 340 tanks. By the cold mathematics of attrition, Das Reich had won. By the strategic reality of the war, they had lost. The Soviet tank force could absorb those losses and rebuild within weeks. Das Reich's panzer strength would never fully recover. But while Das Reich fought at Prokhorovka, other elements of the division were conducting operations that received no mention in official battle reports. Divisional security units, assigned to protect supply lines and rear areas, conducted anti-partisan sweeps in villages behind the front lines. Between July 5th and August 10th, 1943, these security units executed 4,600 civilians accused of partisan activity or supporting partisans. The evidence for these accusations was often nothing more than youth and gender. Military-age males were assumed to be partisans or potential partisans. In several villages, every male between ages 15 and 60 was rounded up and shot. The executions were carried out systematically, with proper documentation, body counts, and after-action reports filed with division headquarters. This was not the random violence of soldiers gone berserk. This was industrial-scale killing conducted as routine security operations. The division fighting with desperate courage at Prokhorovka was simultaneously murdering civilians by the thousands, 40 kilometers behind the lines. These two realities coexisted without apparent contradiction in the minds of Das Reich's leadership. Operation Citadel was called off on July 13th, 1943, after the Soviets launched massive counteroffensives on other sectors of the front, and Hitler needed to withdraw forces to meet those threats. Das Reich had advanced 35 kilometers into the Kursk salient at enormous cost. The entire gain would be surrendered within 2 weeks as the Germans retreated to their starting positions. The battle achieved nothing strategically. It consumed Germany's last major panzer reserve. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. For Das Reich, Kursk marked the transition from offensive to defensive warfare. From July 1943 until the war's end, the division would fight only to hold ground or to retreat. The initiative had passed permanently to the Red Army. But Das Reich had established its reputation as one of the most formidable fighting formations on the Eastern Front. Soviet intelligence assessments from late 1943 identified Das Reich as a priority target. This division should be engaged only with numerical superiority and overwhelming fire support. They are fanatics who will fight to the last man. That assessment was accurate. What it did not mention was that Das Reich was also a criminal organization, systematically murdering civilians across occupied territories. The division's dual nature, elite combat unit and instrument of atrocity, was fully developed by the end of 1943. Every subsequent action would reinforce both aspects. Das Reich would fight brilliantly and murder freely, treating combat excellence and war crimes as complementary rather than contradictory. This is what the reconstitution had created. This is what would continue until the division's destruction. August 15th, 1943, the village of Aktyrka, 40 kilometers south of the Kursk battlefield. Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann sits in his Tiger tank, number 133, watching Soviet infantry probe his battalion's defensive positions. Wittmann is already a legend in Das Reich. 42 confirmed tank kills, recipient of the Knight's Cross, and the embodiment of German armoured superiority. But superiority does not matter today. The Soviets are not trying to destroy his Tigers through direct combat. They are bypassing them, flowing around his positions like water around stones, heading west, always west. Whitman can kill 10 Soviet tanks in an afternoon and it changes nothing. By evening, his battalion receives orders to withdraw to new defensive lines 20 kilometers to the rear. This is the new pattern. Fight, kill, withdraw. Fight, kill, withdraw. Whitman climbs out of his tank and looks east, toward the endless steppe where more Soviet forces are gathering. For the first time in his career, he wonders if Germany can actually lose this war. The thought is unwelcome, he pushes it away, but it returns every time the withdrawal orders come, which is every few days now. The retreat from Kursk began Germany's long withdrawal across Ukraine and southern Russia, a process that would last 15 months and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. Das Reich was assigned as a fire brigade. A mobile reserve rushed to threatened sectors to stabilize collapsing lines, counterattack Soviet breakthroughs, and cover the withdrawal of less capable units. This was recognition of the division's combat effectiveness. It was also a death sentence. Fire brigade units absorbed casualties at rates far exceeding static defensive formations. They were always in crisis, always outnumbered, always fighting to prevent catastrophe rather than achieve victory. Das Reich's assignment as a fire brigade meant it would be at the center of every major Soviet offensive from August 1943 until the division's transfer west in June 1944. The division would fight brilliantly in a losing cause, demonstrating tactical excellence while participating in strategic defeat. And as the retreat accelerated, Das Reich's violence against civilians intensified, as if destroying what they could no longer hold was compensation for military impotence. September 8, 1943. The Dnieper River, Ukraine's great waterway, the last major natural obstacle before the Polish border. Das Reich receives orders to hold bridgeheads on the eastern bank until Wehrmacht engineering units can evacuate critical equipment and supplies across the river. This is a suicide mission disguised as a tactical assignment. The Soviets are pushing west with overwhelming force. Holding fixed positions means absorbing artillery barrages and infantry assaults without the ability to maneuver. Das Reich's Panzer Grenadier regiments dig in around the town of Kaniv, establishing defensive positions on high ground overlooking the river. The Soviet assault begins on September 10th. For 6 days, Das Reich holds against continuous attacks. Soviet artillery pounds the German positions around the clock. Infantry assaults come in waves, sometimes 3 or 4 per day. The Panzer Grenadiers fight from trenches and bunkers, exhausting their ammunition, calling in artillery support that arrives sporadically because German guns are already withdrawing across the river. By September 15th, the bridgehead has shrunk to a perimeter barely 2 kilometers across. Das Reich receives permission to withdraw. The crossing of the Dnieper on the night of September 15th-16th was chaos. Das Reich's remaining vehicles had to use a single pontoon bridge under Soviet artillery fire. The bridge was hit multiple times, requiring emergency repairs, while vehicles backed up on both banks. Infantry crossed in assault boats or swam, abandoning heavy equipment. The Soviets launched a night attack that nearly overran the embarkation point. Das Reich's rear guard, a reinforced company from Regiment Deutschland, fought a desperate delaying action to buy time for the main force to cross. 62 men held the rearguard position, 19 made it across the river, the rest died or were captured. By dawn on September 16th, Das Reich had successfully withdrawn across the Dnieper, but at devastating cost. The bridgehead defence had cost 830 killed, over 2,000 wounded. The division's effective combat strength was now below 10,000 men, and the retreat was just beginning. October through December 1943 became a nightmare of continuous withdrawal punctuated by brief, savage counterattacks. Das Reich would retreat 30 kilometers, the Soviets would follow, Das Reich would turn and maul the pursuing Soviet units, then retreat again. The pattern repeated across central Ukraine. Near Cherkasy, Das Reich counterattacked a Soviet tank brigade, destroying 43 tanks in a 3-hour battle, then withdrew before Soviet reinforcements arrived. At Kirovograd, the division held off an entire Soviet army for 5 days, inflicting casualties estimated at 12,000, then evacuated the city. At Krivoy Rog, Das Reich's Tigers ambushed a Soviet armoured column, leaving 67 destroyed vehicles burning on the highway, then retreated that same night. These were tactical victories that changed nothing strategically. The Red Army kept coming, the Germans kept retreating, and every village Das Reich retreated through was destroyed as they left. November 19th, 1943, the town of Fastov, key rail junction southwest of Kiev. Das Reich has been holding Fastov for 3 days against overwhelming Soviet pressure. The town is surrounded. Soviet artillery has reduced most buildings to rubble. The division's supplies are nearly exhausted. Relief forces that were supposed to break through the encirclement have failed. At 1800 hours, divisional commander orders a breakout. Every vehicle that can move is loaded with wounded. The infantry will fight their way out on foot, heading southwest toward German lines 25 kilometers away. The breakout begins at 2100 under cover of darkness. Soviet forces detect the movement and open fire. Das Reich punches through the encirclement, leaving behind burning vehicles and bodies, their own and the enemy's. The breakout succeeds. 2/3 of the division makes it to friendly lines, but Das Reich leaves Fastov so thoroughly destroyed that the town will not be rebuilt until 1955. Every building demolished, every bridge blown, every rail line torn up. The scorched earth is deliberate. If Germany cannot hold Ukraine, Ukraine will provide nothing to the Soviets who take it. The destruction of Ukraine during the German retreat was systematic and extensive. Das Reich, along with other German divisions, operated under orders that euphemistically called for denial of resources to the enemy. In practice, this meant total devastation. Factories were demolished, power plants destroyed, rail lines torn up for hundreds of kilometers, grain silos burned, livestock slaughtered or driven west, civilian populations forcibly evacuated, ostensibly to protect them from Soviet advance, actually to provide slave labor for German industry. The human cost was staggering. Das Reich's security battalions evacuated approximately 23,000 civilians from villages in its operational area between September and December 1943. Most were packed into freight trains and shipped to labor camps in Poland and Germany. Thousands died in transit. Those who resisted evacuation were shot. The division's war diary from this period contains entries like November 22nd, Korostyshev District. Civilian evacuation completed. 147 residents resisted. Neutralized. Village destroyed per denial protocol. The bureaucratic language disguised mass murder. December 1943, Das Reich establishes defensive positions along the Bug River in central Ukraine, having retreated over 400 kilometers from its July positions at Kursk. The division has been reduced to combat ineffectiveness. Personnel strength is 7,200, barely 1/3 of authorized levels. Tank strength has fallen to 67 operational vehicles from over 200 in July. Entire battalions have been consolidated because there are not enough men to maintain organizational structure. The division requests withdrawal to Germany for reconstitution. The request is denied. Instead, Das Reich receives 4,000 replacements, mostly 17 and 18-year-olds pulled from training before they had completed their courses. The veterans look at these children and see themselves in 1939, unprepared, untested, about to face horrors they cannot imagine. The difference is that these replacements will have weeks, not months, before they face combat. The Red Army is not giving Germany time to train soldiers properly. The new recruits are fed into the defensive lines, assigned to veteran NCOs who will try to keep them alive long enough to learn. Most will be dead within a month. The retreat across Ukraine in late 1943 demonstrated the limits of tactical excellence. Das Reich was still one of the best divisions in the Wehrmacht by any measurable standard. Kill ratios, mission accomplishment, operational flexibility, but none of it mattered. The Soviets had achieved material superiority so overwhelming that German tactical skill could only delay, not prevent, defeat. Das Reich killed 10 Soviet soldiers for every German lost and was still forced to retreat. The division destroyed 3 Soviet tanks for every German tank lost and was still outnumbered in armor by the end of every battle. This was the cruel mathematics of the Eastern Front in 1943. Germany was winning tactically while losing strategically. The soldiers understood this even if they could not articulate it. The letters they wrote home became darker, more fatalistic. One Unteroffizier wrote in December 1943, "We fight well, we kill many, we retreat. Tomorrow we will fight well, kill many, retreat again. I do not know where this ends. I do not know if there is an end. I only know I am tired. That exhaustion, physical and spiritual, was spreading through the division. The aggressive confidence of France and early Barbarossa was gone, replaced by grim determination to survive another day. But even in retreat, even in defeat, Das Reich retained its dual character. The same division that fought with skill and courage against Soviet military forces murdered Ukrainian civilians with systematic thoroughness. Between August and December 1943, Das Reich's security units killed an estimated 12,000 to 18,000 civilians in anti-partisan operations and scorched earth reprisals. These killings were not responses to specific partisan attacks. They were collective punishment terror tactics designed to demonstrate German power, even as that power was clearly failing. The division that could not stop the Red Army's advance could still massacre unarmed villagers. The disconnect was complete. Das Reich's leadership measured success not by territory held, which was slipping away, but by body count, both military and civilian. The after-action reports from this period are documents of organised madness, careful tallies of enemies killed, villages destroyed, civilians executed, all presented as evidence of continued effectiveness. The retreat was turning Das Reich into something even darker than it had been. Defeat was radicalising the division, making it more brutal, more willing to commit atrocities, as if violence against the helpless could compensate for impotence against armed enemies. This pattern would intensify through 1944. The more Das Reich lost militarily, the more vicious it became towards civilians. By the time the division retreated into Poland in early 1944, it had left a trail across Ukraine marked by thousands of graves and hundreds of destroyed villages. The scorched earth was not just physical, but moral. Das Reich was burning its own humanity as thoroughly as it burned Ukrainian homes. January 19th, 1944. A snow-covered field outside Vinnytsia, Ukraine. Captain David Cohen, intelligence officer with the advancing Red Army, walks among bodies frozen in the positions they died. There are 347 corpses arranged in neat rows, all civilians, all shot in the back of the head. The execution site was abandoned in haste when Soviet forces approached faster than expected. Documents left behind in a nearby farmhouse, used as a temporary headquarters, tell the story. They are stamped with Das Reich divisional insignia. Cohen reads through them with growing horror. Requisition forms requesting additional ammunition for security operations, 35,000 rounds in 1 month. Daily reports listing partisans neutralized in numbers that far exceed any actual resistance activity in the sector. Transportation manifests documenting movement of hostile elements to processing centers. And photographs. An SS officer kept photographs. Jews from Vinnytsia's ghetto forced to dig their own graves before Das Reich security troops shot them. Cohen is Jewish, a refugee from Berlin who escaped to Moscow in 1933. He has spent 3 years compiling evidence of German atrocities, but this is different. This is a combat division, not an Einsatzgruppe death squad. This is a military formation whose primary mission should be fighting the Red Army, yet they have devoted enormous resources to murdering civilians. He bags the documents carefully. They will be evidence. Someday, the full scope of Das Reich's crimes has emerged slowly across decades, from documents captured in the war's final weeks, Soviet investigations, survivor testimony, and post-war historical research. The picture that is developed is damning. Das Reich was not merely a combat division that occasionally committed war crimes. It was systematically integrated into the Nazi regime's genocidal policies. Between 1941 and 1944, Das Reich units participated directly in the murder of at least 7,400 Jewish civilians, provided security and logistics support for Einsatzgruppen operations that killed tens of thousands more, and conducted anti-partisan operations so brutal and indiscriminate that they constituted crimes against humanity. These were not the actions of a few criminal individuals. They were institutional practices, ordered by division leadership, executed by regular soldiers, and documented in official records. Das Reich was a criminal organization wearing a military uniform. August 17th, 1941, Minsk, Belarus, then under German occupation. Das Reich's security battalion receives orders to provide a security cordon for an anti-partisan action to be conducted by Einsatzgruppe B. The battalion commander is told that partisans and partisan sympathizers have been identified in a suburb of Minsk and will be processed. The security battalion deploys at dawn, establishing a perimeter around the target area. At 0800, Einsatzgruppe B arrives, 120 SS men in trucks carrying machine guns and shovels. The cordoned area contains approximately 1,000 civilians, mostly Jewish families, who had been forced into a makeshift ghetto. Das Reich troops prevent anyone from leaving, while Einsatzgruppe B forces the civilians to march 3 kilometers to a forested ravine. Das Reich soldiers know what is happening. They can hear the machine gun fire. The shooting continues for 4 hours. 920 people die in that ravine. Das Reich troops maintain their cordon, ensuring no one escapes, then withdraw. The battalion's daily report notes, security cordon provided for anti-partisan operation per orders. No hostile contact. No friendly casualties. The 920 murdered civilians are not mentioned. The pattern repeated across occupied Soviet territories. Das Reich provided logistic support, transportation, cordon security, and sometimes direct participation in mass killings conducted under the euphemism of anti-partisan operations. In many cases, the victims were not partisans but Jewish civilians who had survived the initial Einsatzgruppen sweeps. In other cases, they were Soviet POWs, Romani people, or simply civilians from villages suspected of supporting resistance. The methodology was industrial. Victims were registered, marched to execution sites, shot in groups, buried in mass graves. Das Reich personnel handled various aspects of this machinery. Divisional transport companies moved victims to killing sites. Security battalions provided perimeter security. Combat engineers sometimes dug the mass graves. Administrative personnel documented the killings in reports filed with division headquarters. This was not hidden from the division's leadership. It was part of their operational routine. March 1944, Soviet investigators examining captured German documents discover a requisition form from Das Reich Quartermaster to Army Group Center Supply Depot. The form requests 35,000 rounds of rifle and submachine gun ammunition for rear area pacification operations during the month of February 1944. 35,000 rounds is enough ammunition for a major combat engagement. Das Reich did not fight any major engagements in February 1944. They were in defensive positions on a relatively quiet sector. The ammunition was not used against the Red Army. Soviet investigators cross-referenced this with after-action reports from Das Reich security units operating in the same period. Those reports document the neutralization of 2,140 partisans and partisan sympathizers in February. The correlation is unmistakable. Das Reich was using military supplies to conduct mass executions. The requisition form, like so many documents from this period, reveals the bureaucratic normality of atrocity. An officer fills out a form, someone approves it, ammunition is delivered, people are killed, another form documents the result. Murder as administrative process. The direct participation of Das Reich soldiers in mass shootings is documented in testimony from Ukrainian survivors. In March 1943, near Kharkov, Das Reich security units rounded up 347 Jewish civilians who had survived in hiding after the initial German occupation. The Jews were marched to a forest outside the town, forced to undress, and shot by Das Reich firing squads. A Ukrainian farmer named Petro Kovalenko witnessed the execution from a distance. His testimony, given to Soviet investigators in 1944, describes details that could only have been seen firsthand. The Germans arrived in trucks with the SS runes on the doors. They had the Jews dig pits. Then they shot them in groups of 10 or 15, always in the back of the head. Some Germans took photographs. When it was finished, they pushed dirt over the bodies with a bulldozer and left. The entire process took maybe 3 hours. Kovalenko's testimony was corroborated by other witnesses and by the discovery of the mass grave in the location he described. Physical evidence confirmed 347 bodies, all killed by gunshot to the head. The slave labour operations conducted by Das Reich are less well documented but no less criminal. As the Germans retreated across Ukraine in late 1943, they conducted forced evacuations of civilian populations. The official justification was protecting civilians from Soviet advance. The reality was acquiring slave labour for German industry. Das Reich security units rounded up approximately 3,200 civilians from villages in their operational area between October and December 1943. These civilians were transported to holding camps in Poland, then distributed to labor camps and factories across the Reich. The conditions in these camps were designed to work prisoners to death. Estimates suggest that between 40 and 60% of those forcibly evacuated by Das Reich died within 6 months. The division's role was the initial roundup, entering villages, separating able-bodied workers from children and elderly, loading the workers onto trains, shooting anyone who resisted. Das Reich treated this as routine security work, no different from patrolling supply routes or searching for partisans. The village destruction operations were documented extensively in Das Reich's own records. Between July 1943 and March 1944, the division completely destroyed 187 villages in Ukraine and Belarus. Destroyed meant every structure burned, all livestock killed or confiscated, all food supplies taken or destroyed, and all inhabitants either evacuated west or executed if they resisted. These operations followed scorched earth directives from Army Group Command, but Das Reich interpreted those directives with particular ruthlessness. In many cases, the division destroyed villages that had no military value, were not on retreat routes, and posed no partisan threat. The destruction was punitive and terroristic. Oberfuhrer Heinz Lammerding, who commanded Das Reich from January 1944, explicitly framed these operations in ideological terms. In a February 1944 address to his officers, he stated, "Every village we eliminate is one less source of partisan support, one less nest of Slavic subhumans who oppose German civilization. Do not hesitate, do not show mercy. These are not people in the sense we understand the term, they are obstacles to be removed." This was official division policy, articulated by the commanding officer. The psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary soldiers to participate in these crimes have been studied extensively by historians. Several factors emerged from the evidence. First, ideological indoctrination. Das Reich soldiers had been taught from recruitment that Slavs and Jews were racial inferiors, threats to German survival. This dehumanization made murder psychologically easier. Second, institutional pressure. Orders came from respected commanders, were framed as military necessity, and non-compliance could result in disciplinary action or social ostracism. Third, diffusion of responsibility. Mass shootings were conducted by firing squads, not individuals, allowing each participant to see himself as just following orders, a small part of a larger process. Fourth, brutalization through combat. Soldiers who had experienced the horrors of the Eastern Front became desensitized to violence and death, making the killing of civilians seem less transgressive. Fifth, and perhaps most disturbing, some soldiers appear to have genuinely believed they were protecting Germany from existential threats. They saw themselves not as murderers but as hard men doing necessary work that softer men could not stomach. But not everyone participated willingly. There is evidence, limited but real, of Das Reich soldiers who refused to take part in executions. These cases are important because they demonstrate that participation was a choice, not an inevitability. In October 1943, a Das Reich Unterscharführer named Karl Gärtner refused an order to participate in the shooting of civilians near Judgement. Gärtner was transferred to a combat unit as punishment but was not court-martialed or executed. In February 1944, 3 soldiers from Das Reich's security battalion requested transfers after witnessing mass executions. All 3 requests were granted. These cases show that refusal was possible, that it carried consequences but not fatal ones. Most soldiers did not refuse. They participated, or they stood by and watched, or they simply looked away. The choices they made were individual, but the environment that shaped those choices was institutional. Das Reich created a culture where murder was normalized, where refusing to kill was seen as weakness, and where the only question asked after a massacre was whether the body count had been accurately reported. The legal classification of Das Reich as a criminal organization came at the Nuremberg trials. The International Military Tribunal ruled that the Waffen-SS, including Das Reich, was a criminal organization whose members were collectively responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The tribunal heard extensive evidence of Das Reich's crimes, the massacres in Yugoslavia, the village destructions in Ukraine, the cooperation with Einsatzgruppen, the slave labor operations. The verdict was clear. Das Reich was not a military formation that committed occasional crimes. It was an organization whose entire mode of operation violated the laws of war. Individual Das Reich members could be prosecuted simply for membership in the division after a certain date without having to prove individual criminal acts. This collective guilt finding was controversial and would complicate post-war justice efforts, but it reflected the historical reality. Das Reich's crimes were not aberrations but defining characteristics of how the division operated. By March 1944, as Das Reich prepared to transfer to France for rest and refitting, the division had established a record of criminality unmatched by most Wehrmacht formations. Minimum documented civilian deaths, directly attributable to Das, 25,000. Likely actual total, between 35,000 and 40,000. Jewish victims of direct Das Reich, 7,400 confirmed, possibly 10,000 or more, including those killed in operations where Das Reich provided support. Villages completely destroyed, 187 confirmed, possibly over 200. Civilians forced into slave labor, 3,200 documented. These numbers emerge from captured documents, Soviet investigations, post-war trials, and decades of historical research. They represent minimum estimates. The full scope will never be known because many crimes went undocumented, many documents were destroyed, and many witnesses did not survive. What is certain is that Das Reich spent as much energy murdering civilians as fighting the Red Army. The division's war was not just military, but ideological, racial, genocidal. They were fighting not to defeat an enemy army, but to annihilate a population. This was what the reconstitution of 1942 had created. This was what Himmler's vision of the Waffen-SS had produced, an elite combat formation that was simultaneously an instrument of genocide. The two aspects were inseparable. Das Reich's military effectiveness enabled its crimes by giving it mobility and access. Its ideological indoctrination motivated the crimes by teaching soldiers that murder was duty. The division that had proven itself at Kharkov and Kursk had also proven itself capable of industrialized mass murder. History would remember both. The combat achievements would be noted in military studies. The crimes would be commemorated in memorials across Eastern Europe. Das Reich's legacy would be forever dual. Brilliant soldiers and mass murderers. The same men, the same organization, the same war. June 6, 1944, Normandy beaches, Allied forces storm ashore in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Das Reich is not there. The division is stationed 450 kilometers to the south, near Montauban, resting and refitting after 2 years on the Eastern Front. When news of the invasion reaches division headquarters, the reaction is almost relief. Finally, combat against an enemy the soldiers understand. The Americans and British, not the endless Soviet masses. Orders arrive within hours. Move north to Normandy, engage Allied forces, help throw them back into the sea. Das Reich begins its march on June 7th. The division numbers 19,000 men, nearly full strength, equipped with new tanks including 42 Panthers and 34 Tigers. On paper, Das Reich is one of the most powerful mobile formations in France. The march to Normandy should take 4 to 5 days. It will take 12. The French resistance, alerted to Das Reich's movement by Allied intelligence, launches a campaign of harassment unlike anything the division has faced. Railway lines are sabotaged, bridges are blown, convoys are ambushed, every kilometre north becomes a battle, and Das Reich responds with a fury that will stain its name forever. The march north was chaos from the beginning. Allied air superiority meant Das Reich could move only at night, hiding vehicles in forests during daylight to avoid fighter-bomber attacks. The French resistance, coordinated by SOE and OSS officers, struck constantly. A rail transport carrying Das Reich tanks was derailed near Limoges, killing 6 soldiers and blocking the line for 30 hours. A supply convoy was ambushed outside Toula, losing 8 trucks and their loads. Communication lines were cut repeatedly, forcing the division to rely on motorcycle couriers, who themselves became targets. The frustration built daily. Das Reich soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front where they had crushed partisan resistance through overwhelming brutality, expected to do the same in France. But France was not Ukraine. The resistance fighters were not poorly armed villagers, but organized guerrillas supported by Allied weapons and intelligence. They struck and vanished. Das Reich could not bring its superior firepower to bear against an enemy it could not find. The division's progress slowed to 40 kilometers per day, a crawl for a motorized formation. Divisional Commander Heinz Lammerding raged at the delays, issuing increasingly harsh orders to his security battalions. Partisan activity must be suppressed by all necessary means. Hesitation will not be tolerated. June 9th, 1944. Near Toul, Das Reichs der Führer Regiment enters the town to find evidence of recent resistance activity. The previous day, resistance fighters had attacked a German garrison, killing 40 Wehrmacht soldiers and capturing others before withdrawing. Das Reich was not involved in that fighting, but Lammerding sees an opportunity to demonstrate consequences. He orders the regiment to conduct a reprisal action. On June 10th, Das Reich troops round up all military-age males in Toul, approximately 3,000 men. They are assembled in the town square and inspected. 120 are selected arbitrarily, marched to various locations around town, and hanged from balconies and lampposts. The hangings are public, designed for maximum terroristic effect. The bodies are left on display for 24 hours. 99 die, 21 are cut down, still alive by townspeople after Das Reich departs. Additionally, 149 men are deported to labour camps in Germany. Only 23 will survive the war. Toul is Das Reich's warning to the French population: resist and die. The message will be reinforced the next day in a way that ensures Das Reich is never forgiven. June 10th, 1944, 0600 hours, Oradour-sur-Glane, a village of approximately 650 inhabitants in the Limousin region. The village has no resistance activity, no strategic value, no German garrison. It is simply a French farming community. At 14:15, Das Reich troops, 1st Battalion of the Führer Regiment, commanded by SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Deichmann, surround the village. Soldiers establish a perimeter, blocking all roads. Deichmann has received orders to investigate reports of partisan activity and German prisoners held in the area. The orders are vague, possibly based on false intelligence. What happens next has been reconstructed from survivor testimony and German records. At 15:30, German soldiers enter Oradour and order all inhabitants to assemble in the village square for an identity check. The townspeople comply. They have done nothing wrong. They expect a routine inspection. They are wrong. 15:45, the village square. Das Reich soldiers separate the population. Men are divided into 6 groups and march to barns and garages around the village. Women and children are locked in the church. The men are told they will be searched for weapons. The women are told they will be protected while the searches are conducted. At approximately 1600 hours, the shooting begins. In 6 locations simultaneously, Das Reich troops open fire on the groups of men with machine guns. The men, unarmed and crowded in enclosed spaces, have no chance. Some try to escape. A few succeed. Most are killed in the initial bursts of fire. Those who survive the first volley are finished with pistol shots. In total, 190 men die in the barns and garages. Then the buildings are set on fire to destroy evidence. Meanwhile, at the church, soldiers bring in a large box, possibly containing explosives or incendiaries, and detonate it. The explosion sets the church ablaze. Women and children trapped inside try to escape. Das Reich soldiers posted at the exits shoot anyone who emerges. The church becomes an inferno. 452 people burned to death, 247 women, and 205 children. The youngest is 8 days old. 1700 hours. Oradour burns. Das Reich troops systematically torch the entire village, building by building. They are destroying evidence but also sending a message. The operation is methodical. Soldiers use incendiaries to ensure complete destruction. By evening, Oradour-sur-Glane has ceased to exist as a functioning village. 642 people are dead. Only 6 survive. 1 woman, Marguerite Refanche, escapes the burning church by jumping from a window and hiding until Das Reich withdraws. 5 men feign death among the corpses in the barns and escape after dark. Their testimony will later convict Das Reich soldiers at trial. But on June 10th, 1944, there are no trials. There is only a smoking ruin and a pile of bodies. Das Reich Battalion Commander Deichmann reports to Divisional Headquarters. Partisan stronghold at Oradour eliminated per operational directive. Enemy casualties estimated 600. No prisoners taken. Our casualties, 1 soldier lightly wounded. The massacre is presented as a successful anti-partisan operation. The question that haunts Oradour is why this village. Historians have proposed several theories. First, mistaken identity. Diekmann may have intended to attack Oradour-sur-Glane, 12 kilometers away, where resistance activity had occurred, and attacked the wrong Oradour. Second, reprisal escalation. After the Tula hangings, Diekmann may have sought an even more dramatic demonstration of German power. Third, captured officer. On June 9th, Helmut Kempfer, a Das Reich officer and friend of Diekmann, was captured by resistance fighters and later killed. Diekmann may have ordered the massacre as personal revenge. Fourth, and most disturbing, no reason at all. Oradour may have been selected simply because it was vulnerable, because Das Reich was frustrated by delays and harassment, because the division's institutional culture made mass murder an acceptable response to any provocation or none. The truth likely combines elements of all these factors. What is certain is that Oradour was not accidental. It was not a battle that got out of hand. It was deliberate annihilation of a civilian population, executed with planning and coordination by soldiers who faced no resistance and showed no mercy. The aftermath reveals Das Reich's institutional character. Diekmann died in combat in Normandy on June 29th, before any investigation could occur. But the massacre was known to division headquarters from Diekmann's own report. Lammerding, the divisional commander, took no disciplinary action. He did not investigate. He did not reprimand subordinates. The massacre was accepted as a legitimate operation. When German military authorities later inquired about reports of civilian deaths at Oradour, Das Reich provided a cover story. The village was a partisan stronghold. Resistance fighters used civilians as human shields. The civilian deaths were regrettable but unavoidable consequences of combat against illegal combatants. This lie was maintained officially until after the war. Even in 1944, some German officers knew it was a lie. Wehrmacht liaison officers attached to Das Reich filed protests. These protests were ignored. Das Reich was Himmler's division. It answered to the SS, not the Wehrmacht. And the SS did not punish its soldiers for killing civilians. The 6 survivors of Oradour emerged from hiding to find their world destroyed. Marguerite Ruffage, who escaped the church, lost her husband, son, and daughter in the massacre. She spent months in hiding, traumatized, before Allied forces liberated the area. The 5 men who survived the Barnes lived with survivor's guilt, asking themselves why they lived when everyone else died. Their testimony, given to French investigators in late 1944 and repeated at the Bordeaux trials in 1953, provided the definitive account of what happened. Ruffage described in detail the church burning, the sounds of the dying, the smell of burning flesh. Her testimony, delivered in a flat, traumatized voice, left the courtroom in tears. The men described the machine gun fire in the barns, the methodical way soldiers finished off the wounded, the casual brutality of men who seemed to feel nothing. One survivor, Robert Hebras, would spend the rest of his life, 79 years, telling the story of Oradour, ensuring the world would not forget. He died in January 2023, the last living witness, having given testimony hundreds of times. His final words on the subject: "It should never have happened. It must never happen again." The French state's response to Oradour was to preserve it exactly as Das Reich left it. The ruins were not rebuilt. They stand today as a memorial: the burned-out church, the skeletal remains of houses and shops, the rusted cars. Over 300,000 people visit annually. The preserved ruins are one of the most powerful Holocaust and war crimes memorials in Europe. A museum documents the massacre with photographs, artifacts, and testimony. The message is unambiguous. This is what fascism does. This is the logic of racial ideology taken to its conclusion. This is the price civilians pay when military formations are given unlimited power and indoctrinated to see entire populations as enemies. Oradour is Das Reich's permanent legacy, more enduring than any military achievement, more damning than any other crime. The division committed larger massacres in Eastern Europe, killed more people in single operations in Ukraine and Belarus. But Oradour, preserved in stone and memory, became the symbol of Das Reich's evil. The strategic impact of Oradour was nil. Das Reich continued north to Normandy. The massacre did not suppress resistance. It enraged the French population and intensified partisan activity. Allied intelligence ensured the story spread quickly. French civilians and resistance fighters who might have hesitated to engage German forces felt no such hesitation toward Das Reich. The division was marked when Das Reich troops surrendered to American forces in 1945. French civilians and resistance fighters lobbied for them to be turned over to French justice. Some were, most were not, but the division's name was synonymous with atrocity. Oradour guaranteed that Das Reich would never be remembered for its military accomplishments alone. The tactical skill displayed at Kharkov and Kursk would always be overshadowed by June 10, 1944. 642 lives, mostly women and children, murdered in an afternoon, for nothing, by soldiers who then moved on to the next assignment as if they had done nothing remarkable. That casualness, that banality, is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Oradour was not an aberration for Das Reich. It was an intensification of what the division had been doing for 3 years across Eastern Europe. The difference was that Oradour happened in Western Europe to white Christians in a country that would survive to demand justice and preserve memory. The victims in Ukraine and Belarus had no such advantage. Their massacres were forgotten or denied for decades. Oradour could not be forgotten because the ruins still stand. Das Reich left its monument, a monument to its own damnation. June 18, 1944. Normandy, 12 days after D-Day. Das Reich finally arrives at the front, battered by air attacks and partisan ambushes, having lost 97 vehicles to Allied fighter bombers during the approach march. The division deploys south of Caen, tasked with preventing Allied breakout from the beachhead. Hauptsturmführer Ernst Bachmann, commander of a Panther tank platoon, surveys the battlefield and feels a sick sense of recognition. This is Kursk again. Massive enemy superiority in numbers, total enemy air dominance, defensive positions that must be held against overwhelming assault. But there is a difference. At Kursk, the Soviets eventually ran out of reserves and the battle stabilized. Here, the Allies have inexhaustible reserves. Bachmann watches ships on the horizon, knowing each one carries more men, more tanks, more artillery. The Allies can replace losses overnight. Das Reich has what it arrived with, and nothing more. Replacements are not coming from Germany. The war has consumed them elsewhere. This is the entire division, 19,000 men, fighting an enemy that grows stronger every day. Bachmann's radio crackles with orders to counterattack Allied positions on Hill 112. He acknowledges, orders his platoon forward, and wonders how many days he has left to live. The answer is 43. He will survive, barely, but most of his platoon will not. Hill 112 became Das Reich's Golgotha. This otherwise unremarkable elevation southwest of Caen dominated the surrounding terrain, making it critical to both German defense and Allied offensive plans. Between June 29th and July 10th, 1944, Hill 112 changed hands multiple times in some of the most savage fighting of the Normandy campaign. Das Reich attacked the hill on June 29th, seized it after brutal close combat, then lost it to British counterattack the next day. They retook it on July 1st, lost it July 2nd, retook it July 4th. The hill became a meat grinder, consuming battalions. Every attack required crossing open ground under artillery fire. Every defence meant enduring bombardments that buried men alive in their trenches. The casualties were catastrophic. In 8 days of fighting over one geographical feature, Das Reich suffered 2,340 killed or wounded. That represented 12% of divisional strength expended for temporary possession of a hill that ultimately remained in Allied hands. The fighting at Hill 112 demonstrated both Das Reich's tactical skill and the futility of that skill against material superiority. German soldiers fought with desperate courage, launching counterattacks against numerically superior British forces, holding positions under artillery barrages that Wehrmacht veterans compared to the worst of the Eastern Front. Individual acts of valor were common: tanks, crews fighting to the last shell, infantry squads holding positions long after they should have retreated, officers rallying shattered companies for one more attack. But courage could not overcome mathematics. For every German soldier, there were 5 Allied soldiers. For every German tank, 4 Allied tanks. For every German artillery shell, 10 Allied shells. And most devastating, for every German casualty, there was no replacement. For every Allied casualty, there were 10 men waiting to take his place. Das Reich was being ground down by attrition warfare it could not win. The psychological impact of Normandy on Das Reich soldiers was profound. Veterans of the Eastern Front found the Western Allies fought differently than the Soviets. The British and Americans relied more on firepower, less on mass infantry assault. They would bombard a position for hours, reducing it to rubble, then advanced methodically with tank and infantry support. There was less fanaticism than Soviet attacks, but more professionalism. Das Reich soldiers learned to respect their enemies. Letters home from this period express grudging admiration. The Americans fight carefully, wasting ammunition but saving lives. They are not reckless like the Russians, but they are relentless. They never stop, the artillery never stops, the aircraft never stop. We are being worn away. That sense of being worn away, eroded by constant pressure, was new for a division accustomed to mobile warfare and dramatic victories. Normandy was static warfare, defensive warfare, losing warfare. It was psychologically devastating. July 10th, 1944. A British artillery barrage precedes another assault on Hill 112. Gefreiter Hans Frick huddles in a destroyed farmhouse that serves as a forward observation post. He has been on this hill for 6 days. His original squad of 12 is now 3 men. They have no rations, little ammunition, and no prospect of relief. The British artillery is methodical, walking shells across the German positions, ensuring nothing survives. Frick's shelter collapses partially. He is buried up to his waist in rubble. His squad mates dig him out. The barrage lifts. British infantry, supported by Churchill tanks, advance up the hill. Frick's position has one MG-42 machine gun with 2 belts of ammunition remaining. They wait until the British are within 100 metres, then open fire. The British go to ground, call in more artillery. The cycle repeats. This is Frick's war now. Wait, shoot, survive, repeat. He has stopped thinking about victory. He thinks only about lasting until nightfall, when maybe they can withdraw. The hill falls again that evening. Das Reich retreats. Frick survives. He will be killed 3 weeks later when his position takes a direct hit from naval gunfire. He will be 19 years old. Allied air superiority was the decisive factor in Normandy. Das Reich, like all German formations, could move only at night. Daylight movement invited immediate air attack. Allied fighter bombers, Thunderbolts and Typhoons patrolled constantly, attacking anything that moved. They struck with rockets and cannons, destroying vehicles, killing men in open ground, forcing the Germans to remain immobile during the day. Das Reich's tank losses to air attack exceeded losses to ground combat. Between June 18th and August 20th, the division lost 143 tanks and assault guns. 97 were destroyed by Allied aircraft. This made offensive operations nearly impossible. How do you concentrate armour for an attack when assembling tanks in daylight draws immediate airstrikes? Das Reich adapted by conducting all movements and attacks at night, but night operations are slower, more chaotic, harder to control. The division's tactical advantage, its ability to manoeuvre rapidly and strike decisively, was neutralised by Allied air power. The relationship between Das Reich and other German units in Normandy was complicated by the division's reputation. Wehrmacht officers knew about Oradour. The massacre had been reported in Allied propaganda and was known throughout the German forces. Some Wehrmacht commanders requested that Das Reich not be positioned adjacent to their units. The stated reason was tactical. Das Reich's aggressive tactics drew disproportionate Allied attention, making neighbouring sectors more dangerous. The unstated reason was moral. Some Wehrmacht officers wanted nothing to do with a formation that had massacred French civilians. This created an unusual situation where one of Germany's elite divisions was simultaneously valued for combat effectiveness and isolated for criminality. Das Reich operated increasingly independently, assigned to critical sectors but not integrated into broader corps-level operations. The division was trusted to fight but not trusted with honour. August 7th, 1944. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's desperate counter-offensive at Mortain. The Führer, detached from reality, orders an attack to split the Allied armies and reach the sea, cutting off American forces in Brittany. The plan is militarily absurd. It requires concentrating German armour in terrain dominated by Allied air power, attacking an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority, and advancing 70 kilometres through contested territory. Das Reich is assigned to spearhead the attack alongside 3 panzer divisions. The attack begins at midnight, the only time German armour can move. Initial progress is good. Das Reich advances 12 kilometres, overrunning surprised American positions, seizing the town of Mortain. Then dawn comes. Allied aircraft appear by the hundreds. The Typhoons arrive first, firing rockets that can penetrate tank armor, then the Thunderbolts with bombs and napalm, then the medium bombers. The German advance halts as formations disperse to avoid air attack. By mid-morning, the counteroffensive is dead. Das Reich withdraws, having lost 38 tanks in 18 hours, 31 to air attack, 7 to ground combat. The failure at Mortain marked the end of German offensive capability in Normandy. From that point forward, Das Reich fought only to delay the inevitable. The Allies launched their own offensive, Operation Cobra, breaking out of the Normandy beachhead and sweeping south and east. German forces, including Das Reich, faced encirclement in the Falaise pocket. Between August 12th and August 20th, Allied forces closed a massive trap around the remnants of German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. Das Reich was caught in that trap. The division fought desperate rearguard actions to keep the pocket open, allowing other German units to escape eastward. The fighting was chaotic, with formations disintegrating, command structures collapsing, and individual units fighting for survival rather than coordinated objectives. Das Reich's cohesion held better than most, but the casualties were staggering. 7,500 killed, wounded, or missing in 8 days. 75% of the division's armor destroyed. By the time survivors reached German lines east of the pocket, Das Reich had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. August 21st, 1944, east of Falaise, approximately 3,000 Das Reich soldiers, all that remains of the 19,000 who entered Normandy 2 months earlier, assemble in a forest. They have no heavy weapons, no vehicles, almost no ammunition. They have walked out of the pocket, fighting through Allied lines in small groups, abandoning everything they could not carry. Divisional Commander Lamading conducts a brief roll call. Of 12 infantry battalions, only fragments of 4 remain. Of 4 panzer companies, 32 tanks survive, mostly damaged and awaiting repair. The reconnaissance battalion is gone, most artillery batteries destroyed. Lamading addresses the survivors. You have fought with honor against overwhelming odds. The division will reconstitute and fight again. The soldiers listen in silence. They do not look like they have fought with honor. They look like defeated men who have survived catastrophe through luck more than skill. That night, they march east toward Germany, leaving France behind. Normandy has broken Das Reich as thoroughly as Moscow did in 1941, but this time there will be less time to recover. The war is accelerating toward its conclusion. Das Reich will be rebuilt again, thrown into battle again, destroyed again. The pattern is becoming mechanical. What these soldiers do not yet know is that the worst is still ahead. November 23rd, 1944. Paderborn, Germany. Training grounds covered in early snow. 17-year-old Rottenführer Dieter Schulz stands in formation with 7,800 other soldiers, most as young as he is. They are the reconstituted Das Reich division, rebuilt from the wreckage of Normandy, with teenagers, walking wounded, returned from hospitals, and transfers from disbanded Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine units who have never served as infantry. Schulz joined the Waffen-SS in September, 3 weeks after his 17th birthday, pulled directly from Hitlerjugend leadership school. He has completed 8 weeks of basic training, half the normal course. He can field strip an MG42, throw a grenade, and recite the SS oath from memory. He has never fired at a living target. Now he stands with Das Reich, one of the Wehrmacht's most decorated divisions, rebuilt to 80% strength through desperate measures. The division's new tanks, 184 of them, are a mix of refurbished Panthers, salvaged from Normandy, Tigers pulled from other units, and outdated Panzer IVs. The average age of the division is now 18.2 years. These are not soldiers. These are children given weapons and told they will save Germany. Schulz believes it because he has been taught to believe nothing else. In 6 weeks, he will be in Belgium, fighting for his life in snow and darkness. In 8 weeks, he will be dead. The reconstitution of Das Reich in autumn 1944 was an exercise in self-delusion. Germany no longer had the resources to rebuild elite divisions properly. But Hitler's plan for a final offensive in the West required formations with prestigious names and recent combat experience. Das Reich qualified on paper. In reality, the division being rebuilt bore little resemblance to the formation that had fought in France and Russia. Of the 3,000 survivors of Normandy, only about 2,000 remained with the division. The rest were distributed as cadre to other units or hospitalized with wounds. The gap to reach authorized strength of 22,000 was filled with whoever the SS recruiting system could scrape together. The result was a division that looked formidable in organizational charts but was hollow at its core. The veterans knew. They looked at the teenage replacements and saw corpses waiting to happen. But the replacements, indoctrinated since childhood, believed in final victory with the fervor of religious conviction. December 10th, 1944. A classroom in Paderborn. Das Reich's new soldiers attend a briefing on the coming operation. The briefer, an SS Hauptsturmführer who lost an arm at Kursk, describes the plan: a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest, splitting American and British forces, recapturing Antwerp, forcing the Western Allies to negotiate peace so Germany can concentrate on defeating the Soviets. The plan requires advancing 150 kilometers through enemy territory in winter, across poor roads, with limited fuel and ammunition, against an enemy with total air superiority. The soldiers listen with shining eyes. They have been promised that new wonder weapons will turn the tide, that the Allies are brittle and will collapse under determined assault, that this offensive will change the war's course. The briefer does not mention that the plan requires capturing Allied fuel dumps because German supply cannot support the advance. He does not mention that the operation is scheduled for a week when weather forecasts predict clear skies, allowing Allied aircraft to operate freely. He does not mention that even if everything goes perfectly, the offensive has no realistic chance of reaching Antwerp. These truths are not for the ranks. The ranks need faith, not reality. December 16th, 1944. 0530. The German-Belgian border. Operation Wacht am Rhein begins. Das Reich crosses into Belgium in fog and snow as part of 6th SS Panzer Army, tasked with the northern thrust toward Antwerp. The initial advance is spectacular. American forces, thinly stretched along what had been a quiet sector, are caught completely by surprise. Das Reich punches through the American front, advancing 42 kilometers in the first 60 hours. The Green replacements fight with suicidal courage born of ideological fervor. They have been taught that retreat is betrayal, that death for the Führer is the highest honor. They charge American positions that should be bypassed, taking casualties but achieving objectives. The veterans shake their heads and try to keep the kids alive. It works for 3 days, then reality intervenes. December 19th, near Bastogne. Das Reich's advance stalls 15 kilometers short of its objective. The American defenders, elements of the 101st Airborne, have fortified the town and refused to surrender despite being surrounded. Das Reich is assigned to assist in reducing the Bastogne pocket, but the division has a more immediate problem: fuel. The advance consumed Das Reich's allocated fuel in 3 days instead of the planned 5. The captured American fuel dumps the plan depended on were either evacuated before German forces arrived or defended too strongly to take. Das Reich's tanks sit immobile, waiting for fuel that is not coming. Panzer Grenadiers advance on foot, but without armor support, they cannot break American positions. The offensive, so promising on December 16th, is already dying. The soldiers do not know this yet. They believe the fuel will arrive, that the offensive will resume, that victory is still possible. The officers know better. Division Commander Lammerding sends increasingly desperate messages to Corps headquarters. Require immediate fuel resupply to continue operations. Current stocks sufficient for maximum 12 hours combat. The response is always the same. Fuel is coming. Maintain pressure. Do not withdraw. December 23rd. The weather clears. For 2 days, heavy cloud cover has grounded Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to move and fight without air attack. Now the clouds break. The sky fills with Allied planes. P-47s and Typhoons appear first, strafing German columns. Then the medium bombers, B-26s, dropping their loads on German assembly areas. Das Reich's march columns, exposed on snow-covered roads, are massacred. In 1 day, December 23rd, 1944, Das Reich loses 38 tanks to air attack, not to ground combat, to aircraft. The division's already critical fuel situation becomes catastrophic because fuel trucks are priority targets for Allied pilots. By evening on December 23rd, Das Reich is combat ineffective. The division has advanced 52 kilometers from its starting positions. It will advance no farther. The Ardennes offensive has failed for Das Reich. though the battle will continue for another month as other German formations make futile attacks elsewhere. The human cost of the Ardennes became apparent as Das Reich withdrew to defensive positions in early January 1945. 4,200 casualties in 3 weeks, 1,900 killed, 2,300 wounded or missing. The dead included a disproportionate number of the teenage replacements who had charged American positions with more enthusiasm than tactical sense. Dieter Schultz, the 17-year-old Rottenführer, died on December 28th when his squad attacked an American bunker position near Bastogne. He was shot 6 times while attempting to throw a grenade through a firing slit. His body was recovered by American forces and buried in a mass grave with other German dead. His parents would not learn of his death until March 1945, when an official notification arrived. The letter said he had fallen honourably in defence of the fatherland. It did not say he had bled to death in Belgian snow, calling for his mother 19 days after his 18th birthday, December 26th. Patton's Third Army breaks through to Bastogne from the south, relieving the besieged garrison. Das Reich, positioned north of the town, is too weak to prevent the relief. The division withdraws that night, retreating toward German lines under cover of darkness. The withdrawal is orderly at first, then degenerates into chaos as American artillery begins ranging on the retreat routes. Vehicles are abandoned when they run out of fuel or break down. Wounded men are left in field hospitals with volunteer medics who know they will be captured. The retreat becomes a rout. By December 28th, Das Reich has withdrawn 30 kilometres, surrendering all gains from the offensive. The division occupies defensive positions along the Our River, back where it started 2 weeks earlier. The Ardennes gamble has failed completely. The massacre at Malmedy haunted Das Reich, even though the division was not directly involved. On December 17th, soldiers from 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, murdered 84 American POWs at a crossroads near Malmedy. The massacre was witnessed by survivors who escaped and reported to American commands. The story spread through Allied forces within hours. The SS was executing prisoners. From that point forward, American soldiers treated all Waffen-SS formations, including Das Reich, with particular hatred. Surrender became difficult for Das Reich soldiers. American units, especially those that had heard about Malmedy or Oradour, were less likely to accept surrender from SS troops. Some Das Reich soldiers attempting to surrender were shot on sight in acts of battlefield justice or revenge. This created a vicious cycle. Das Reich soldiers, knowing they might be killed if they surrendered, fought with desperate determination. American soldiers, facing fanatical resistance from SS troops, became less willing to offer quarter. The battlefield brutalized both sides, though the moral responsibility lay with the SS for establishing the pattern through their own crimes. January 1945, Das Reich occupies frozen foxholes along the Our River, back in Germany, watching American forces consolidate their positions in Belgium. The soldiers who survived the Ardennes are different from those who entered it. The ideological certainty has cracked. They have seen the offensive fail despite propaganda promises of victory. They have watched their friends die for gains that were immediately lost. They have experienced the overwhelming power of Allied material superiority, the endless artillery, the omnipresent aircraft, the tanks that replaced losses faster than Das Reich could destroy them. Conversations in the foxholes turn dark. Soldiers whisper questions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Can Germany still win? Is the Führer's strategy sound? Should we be fighting the West when the Soviets are approaching German borders? These questions are treason, but exhaustion and disillusionment make soldiers careless. The fanaticism is burning out, replaced by grim fatalism. They will continue fighting because they know no alternative, because desertion means execution, because the Eastern Front offers no hope of survival. But they no longer believe in victory. They fight now simply to survive another day. The strategic consequences of the Ardennes offensive were catastrophic for Germany. The operation consumed the Wehrmacht's last mobile reserves, forces that could have been used to defend against the coming Soviet winter offensive or to stabilize crumbling positions in the West. Instead, those forces were expended in a failed gamble based on Hitler's delusion that the Western Alliance would collapse under pressure. For Das Reich specifically, the Ardennes destroyed what remained of the division's combat effectiveness. The survivors who retreated into Germany in January 1945 were a broken formation, understrength, demoralized, short of equipment and supplies. The division would be rebuilt one more time, sent east to fight the Soviets in Hungary in the war's final weeks, but Das Reich, as a cohesive, effective fighting force, died in the Ardennes. What continued after January 1945 was a ghost, a name on organizational charts, an assemblage of survivors and replacements going through the motions of combat because no one had ordered them to stop. January 8th, 1945, Das Reich receives new orders. The division will be withdrawn from the Western Front, sent east to Hungary, where Soviet forces are threatening Vienna and the Austrian oil fields that keep German war production functioning. The soldiers receive this news with horror. The Eastern Front is where German soldiers go to die. Everyone knows the Soviets are exacting terrible revenge for German atrocities. Das Reich soldiers know their division's reputation precedes them. They know what Soviet forces do when they capture SS troops. Some men desert, not many, but enough to be noticed. They disappear during night movements, slip away from their units, head west to surrender to the Americans. Most stay because desertion means death for their families under Nazi reprisal laws. They stay because they have nowhere else to go. They stay because the Wehrmacht's institutional momentum carries them forward even as Germany collapses around them. On January 23rd, Das Reich begins the rail movement east, cramming exhausted soldiers into freight cars, heading toward Hungary and the war's final apocalypse. The Ardennes has broken them. Hungary will destroy them, but that is still weeks away. For now, they huddle in unheated train cars, watching Germany slide past the windows, and wonder how it came to this. The wonder weapons never appeared. The promised fuel never arrived. The Allies never collapsed. Everything they were told was a lie, but they are still here, still moving toward battle, still wearing the uniform that has become a death sentence. The Ardennes gamble failed. The division survives. Barely, for now. January 15th, 1945. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western fortifications. Oberscharführer Kurt Weber, 24 years old, veteran of France, Russia, and Normandy, watches American artillery pound German positions for the 6th consecutive hour. He sits in a concrete bunker that was supposed to be impregnable, built in the 1930s when Germany prepared for a defensive war. The bunker is not impregnable. American 155mm shells are systematically demolishing the fortifications. Weber's bunker has taken 4 near misses. Cracks spread across the ceiling. Dust fills the air with every impact. Outside, the Siegfried Line, the supposed shield of the fatherland, is being reduced to rubble. Weber thinks about the civilians he passed yesterday, refugees fleeing east, away from the advancing Americans, women and children pushing carts loaded with possessions, walking through snow. They looked at his uniform, at the SS runes, and their expressions were not gratitude but fear. Fear of the Americans who chased them, but also fear of the SS, who might shoot them for defeatism. Weber knows that has been happening. Das Reich's security detachments have been executing civilians for undermining military morale. He has seen the bodies, German bodies, hung from lampposts with signs, "I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland." The war has come home to Germany, and it is devouring its own. The retreat into Germany began with the failure of the Ardennes offensive and accelerated through January and February 1945 as Allied forces pushed east. Das Reich, assigned to hold sections of the Siegfried Line, found itself defending the very territory it had departed from in 1940 with such confidence. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers were now fighting on German soil, watching their own towns and cities destroyed by the war they had brought to other countries. The propaganda had promised this would never happen. The Siegfried Line would hold, German technology would prevail, the Allies would be thrown back. None of it was true. The Siegfried Line was obsolete, designed against the weapons of the 1930s, inadequate against the artillery and air power of 1945. Das Reich held their assigned sectors for days, sometimes a week, then retreated under overwhelming pressure. The retreat was orderly initially, then increasingly chaotic as command structures broke down and soldiers realized they were defending a corpse. February 3rd, 1945. The town of Prüm, just inside Germany's western border. Das Reich has been ordered to hold the town for 72 hours to allow other units to establish defensive positions further east. The defense lasts 48 hours before American armor breaks through. Hauptsturmführer Werner Wolf, survivor of Yelnya, Moscow, Kharkov, Kursk, Normandy, and the Ardennes, commands the rear guard covering the retreat. His company, 120 men on paper, numbers 43 effective soldiers. They hold a bridge over the Prum River against American armor, destroying 2 Sherman tanks with Panzerfaust rockets before withdrawing. As Wolfe's company retreats through the town, they pass the local Nazi party headquarters. The party officials have already fled, abandoning files and equipment. The building is empty except for propaganda posters still on the walls, "Victory or Siberia," and "The Führer will save us." Wolfe stops, stares at the posters, and laughs bitterly. One of his soldiers asks, "What's funny?" "Everything we were told was a lie," Wolfe says, "and we killed for those lies." He orders the company to keep moving. They abandon Prum that evening. American forces occupy the town without resistance the next morning. The execution of German civilians by SS units in early 1945 represents one of the war's most disturbing chapters. As Allied forces approached, Nazi authorities implemented draconian measures to prevent defeatism. Civilians who suggested surrender, who spoke of Germany losing the war, who failed to resist the enemy adequately, faced summary execution. Das Reich's security detachments participated in these executions. Between January and March 1945, Das Reich security units executed an estimated 60 to 80 German civilians for various forms of defeatism or cowardice. The charges were often absurd. A baker in Bitburg was hung for saying the war was lost. A farmer near Koblenz was shot for hiding food instead of surrendering it to retreating German troops. A teenage girl in Trier was executed for attempting to remove a Nazi flag from a government building. These executions were public, designed to terrorize the population into continued resistance. They achieved the opposite. German civilians began to fear their own forces as much as the approaching Allies. February 12, 1945, a village outside Frankfurt, Das Reich Security Battalion establishes a roadblock, checking civilians for deserters and draft evaders. A woman in her 50s, carrying a suitcase, tries to pass through. She is stopped, searched. Inside her suitcase, soldiers find civilian clothes that belong to her son, a Wehrmacht soldier who deserted 3 weeks earlier and is now hiding in her basement. The woman is interrogated. She refuses to reveal her son's location. The battalion commander, an SS Hauptsturmführer named Kraus, orders her shot as an example. She is executed in the village square. 17 civilians are forced to watch. Kraus addresses them. "This is the fate of traitors and those who shelter traitors. Germany demands your loyalty unto death. Anyone who betrays that loyalty will face the consequences." The villagers stand silent. After Das Reich withdraws, American forces occupy the village 2 days later. The woman's son emerges from hiding and surrenders to the Americans. He tells them what happened to his mother. The American commander files a report documenting the incident for war crimes investigation. The report joins thousands of others. Kraus will never be found or prosecuted. He disappears into the chaos of the war's end. March 7th, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany's last major natural barrier in the west. Das Reich has been assigned to defend a section of the West Bank near Koblenz. The mission is futile from the start. The Americans have already seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, establishing a bridgehead across the Rhine. German forces, including Das Reich, are trapped on the West Bank with the river at their backs and American armies pressing from the west. The retreat to the Rhine becomes a nightmare, roads clogged with refugees and retreating military units, Allied aircraft attacking anything that moves, artillery fire from American forces who have reached positions overlooking the river. Das Reich fights a series of delaying actions, trying to hold long enough for engineers to evacuate equipment across the river. The casualties are severe, 3,000 killed, wounded, or captured in 2 weeks of fighting. The survivors cross the Rhine on the night of March 21st to 22nd, using improvised ferries and assault boats. They leave behind all their heavy equipment, most vehicles, and hundreds of wounded who cannot be evacuated. The American artillery pounds the crossing sites. Men drown in the dark water. The division that reaches the East Bank numbers 6,100 effectives. Das Reich has been reduced by 60% in 6 weeks. The orders that arrived on March 23rd destroyed what remained of morale. Das Reich would not defend Germany. The division was being withdrawn from the Western Front and transferred to Hungary, to the Eastern Front, where the Soviets were advancing toward Vienna. The reaction among the soldiers was despair. They understood what this meant. Germany was writing off the West, concentrating what remained of its strength in the East, trying to hold the Soviets away from the German heartland. Das Reich was being sacrificed in Hungary so that other formations could defend Berlin. The soldiers knew the Soviets had lists. They knew Das Reich's name was on those lists. They knew Soviet forces showed SS prisoners no mercy. Some men deserted immediately upon hearing the orders. They slipped away in the night, heading west, hoping to surrender to Americans before the movement east began. Most stayed because desertion meant execution and reprisal against families. They stayed because the Wehrmacht's discipline held even as everything else collapsed. They stayed because after 5 years of war, they knew nothing else. March 28th. The rail yards at Wiesbaden. Das Reich loads onto trains for the journey to Hungary. The scene is chaotic. Soldiers pack into freight cars designed for 40 men or 8 horses. Each car holds 60, 70 men. There is no heat. Rations are scarce. The trains move slowly, stopping frequently as Allied aircraft attack rail lines. The journey that should take 3 days requires 8. Men die in transit from wounds, disease, exhaustion. The trains pass through German cities, destroyed by Allied bombing: Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Munich. Soldiers stare out through gaps in the freight car walls at the ruins. This is what they were defending. This is what their war achieved. Cities reduced to rubble. Populations homeless and starving. The Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, is dying after 12. Some soldiers weep. Others sit in silence. A few sing old marching songs, but the songs die out quickly. There is nothing to sing about. April 2nd, 1945. The Hungarian border. Das Reich detrains and begins movement toward Budapest. The division's strength is now 9,400 men, having absorbed some stragglers and replacements during the journey. They have minimal heavy equipment, 37 operational tanks salvaged from various units. Artillery is limited to what could be transported by rail. The division is a shadow of what it was in June 1944, let alone June 1941. But orders are orders. Das Reich will attack Soviet positions around Budapest, attempting to relieve German forces trapped in the city. The soldiers prepare for battle with grim resignation. They know this is suicide. They know Budapest has likely already fallen. They know the war is lost. But they are Das Reich. They have fought from France to Moscow to Normandy and back. They will fight once more because they know no alternative. The division's war diary, maintained sporadically in these final weeks, contains an entry dated April 2nd, 1945. Division arrived Hungarian operational area. Morale low but discipline maintained. All ranks understand the gravity of the situation. We will do our duty. Duty. The word appears again and again in the final documents. Not victory, not honour, just duty. The mechanical performance of assigned tasks, because the alternative is unthinkable. Das Reich moves toward Budapest and its final battle. April 5th, 1945. The outskirts of Budapest. Sturmman Friedrich Bauer, 18 years old, replacement who joined Das Reich in February, stares across the Danube at a city that no longer exists. Budapest is rubble. 3 months of fighting between German and Soviet forces have reduced Hungary's capital to a moonscape of destroyed buildings and cratered streets. Smoke still rises from fires that have burned for weeks. Bauer's platoon has been ordered to cross the river and reinforce German positions, still holding in Buda, the western half of the city. The crossing will be under Soviet fire. Life expectancy for soldiers entering Budapest is measured in hours, not days. Bauer checks his rifle, a Kar-98 that belonged to someone who no longer needs it. He has 300 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, and a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket. He is supposed to use these to fight the Red Army, which has thousands of tanks, unlimited artillery, and absolute air superiority. Bauer thinks about his mother in Hamburg, wonders if she is still alive, wonders if he will ever see her again. The answer is no, but he does not know that yet. At 2100 hours, his platoon climbs into assault boats and paddles toward Budapest. Soviet machine guns open fire when they are halfway across. Bauer will die on April 8th, shot through the chest during street fighting in Buda. He will be one of approximately 15,000 German soldiers who die in the final battle for Budapest. His body will never be identified or recovered. The battle for Budapest had been raging since December 1944, when Soviet forces encircled the city, trapping approximately 100,000 German and Hungarian defenders. Hitler declared Budapest a fortress that must be held at all costs, condemning the garrison to a siege that would last until February 13, 1945, when survivors attempted a breakout that turned into a massacre. Das Reich was not part of the original siege defense. The division arrived in early April as part of a desperate attempt to relieve the city after it had already fallen. The operation was militarily nonsensical, attacking to relieve a garrison that no longer existed, but Hitler's orders demanded it, and so Das Reich attacked. Between April 6th and April 13th, the division launched a series of assaults attempting to reach Budapest from the southwest. The attacks gained ground measured in kilometres. The cost was catastrophic. April 8, 1945, Das Reich's 2nd Panzer Battalion attacks Soviet positions defending approaches to Budapest. The battalion has 17 operational tanks, a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs. They face Soviet defences that include dug-in 34s, anti-tank guns, and infantry armed with anti-tank rockets. The German attack begins at dawn with a brief artillery barrage, all the division can afford with its limited ammunition. The panzers advance across open terrain, exposed to Soviet fire. Within 30 minutes, 9 tanks are destroyed or disabled. The surviving tanks reach the Soviet first line, engage in close-range combat, destroy several Soviet positions, then are forced to withdraw as Soviet reinforcements arrive. The battalion retreats having gained nothing. 8 tanks return, 34 crewmen are dead, 22 wounded. The battalion is no longer combat effective. Similar scenes play out across Das Reich's area of operations. Every attack achieves local success, then fails to strategic irrelevance. The division is bleeding out for objectives that do not matter. The Soviet revenge on Das Reich began before combat even started. Red Army intelligence had identified Das Reich's arrival in Hungary. Soviet political officers informed their troops that they were facing one of the most criminal SS divisions responsible for massacres across the Soviet Union. The message was clear: no prisoners. When Das Reich soldiers attempted to surrender, they were often shot on sight. Soviet soldiers had photographs taken from dead German soldiers or found in captured positions. Photographs of massacres, of burning villages, of executed civilians. Some Soviet units carried these photographs into battle, showing them to their men before assaults. This is what they did to our people. Show them no mercy. The battlefield became a place where quarter was neither asked nor given. Das Reich soldiers fought with desperate ferocity because they knew capture meant torture and death. Soviet soldiers attacked with vengeful fury because they were settling accounts for 3 years of German atrocities. The fighting around Budapest was combat stripped of any humanitarian restraint. It was mutual extermination. April 10th, 1945. A Das Reich company, reduced to 38 men, defends a fortified manor house outside Budapest. They have been holding this position for 4 days against continuous Soviet assault. Food is gone. Water is scarce. Ammunition is critically low. The company commander, a lieutenant who is the only surviving officer, calls division headquarters requesting permission to withdraw. The request is denied. The position must be held. At 1400 hours, Soviet artillery begins the heaviest bombardment the company has experienced. For 2 hours, shells pound the manor house. The building collapses in sections, burying men alive. When the barrage lifts, Soviet infantry attacks, supported by tanks. The Das Reich soldiers, dazed and wounded, fight from the ruins. They kill approximately 60 Soviet soldiers before being overrun. 12 Germans survive to be taken prisoner. None will survive Soviet captivity. Their names appear on a Soviet list of Das Reich prisoners compiled in May 1945. Next to each name, the notation, died in custody. The breakout attempt from Budapest's outskirts came on April 13, when Das Reich received orders to withdraw from its advanced positions and regroup for operations around Vienna. The retreat was conducted under Soviet pursuit, a nightmarish fighting withdrawal through destroyed villages and contested forests. Das Reich fought continuous rearguard actions, delaying Soviet advances to allow other German units to escape. The division's infantry battalions, already depleted, were consumed in these actions. Companies disappeared entirely, overrun or isolated and destroyed. The panzer units fought mobile delaying actions, ambushing Soviet columns, then withdrawing before being encircled. By April 15th, when Das Reich reached relative safety west of Budapest, the division had lost another 4,100 men. Total casualties in the Budapest operations, 8,600 killed, wounded, or missing in 9 days of fighting. The division's effective strength was now approximately 2,300 combat soldiers. April 16, 1945. Vienna, Austria's capital, Hitler's birthplace city, is now in the path of Soviet advance. Das Reich, or what remains of it, is ordered to defend Vienna's southern approaches. The soldiers receive this order with numb acceptance. They are beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, beyond hope. They fight now because stopping means dying, and forward movement, even towards certain death, feels like agency. The defense of Vienna lasts 6 days. Das Reich establishes defensive positions in the city's suburbs, fortifies buildings, lays mines, prepares to sell their lives expensively. The Soviet assault begins on April 13 with massive artillery preparation. Das Reich's positions are obliterated by bombardment that surpasses anything they experienced even at Kursk. The ground shakes continuously, buildings collapse, soldiers lose their hearing, their minds. Some simply walk into the open, seeking death to end the horror. When Soviet infantry advances, Das Reich fights from the rubble with whatever weapons remain functional: machine guns until they jam, rifles until ammunition is exhausted, grenades and bayonets and bare hands. The final documented war crime committed by Das Reich occurred on May 4, 1945, 4 days before Germany's surrender. In the village of Pöcklarn, west of Vienna, a Das Reich security detachment executed 12 Hungarian civilians accused of providing information to Soviet forces. The civilians were shot in the village square. The execution was witnessed by Austrian civilians who later provided testimony to Allied investigators. The Das Reich officer who ordered the execution, whose name appears in witness statements as Hauptsturmführer Reiner, was never identified or prosecuted. He likely died in the final days of fighting or disappeared into the chaos of the war's end. This final massacre, 12 people killed for no military purpose in the war's last hours, encapsulates Das Reich's character. Even at the moment of total defeat, even when the war was obviously lost, the division continued to murder civilians. The killing had become reflexive, instinctive, divorced from any rational military purpose. It was simply what Das Reich did. May 6, 1945, the Austrian Alps, 50 kilometers west of Vienna, approximately 460 Das Reich soldiers are moving west, trying to reach American lines before Soviet forces capture them. They are all that remains of a division that once numbered over 20,000. They have abandoned their vehicles, their heavy weapons, everything that cannot be carried. They wear a mix of uniforms, some SS, some Wehrmacht, some civilian clothes taken from abandoned homes. The SS runes have been torn from uniforms or covered with mud. They are trying to hide what they are because they know what happens to SS prisoners captured by the Soviets. The group is led by a handful of officers, including Sturmbannführer Otto Weidinger, veteran of France, Russia, and every major battle Das Reich fought. Weidinger navigates by compass, leading his men through forests and mountains, avoiding roads where Soviet patrols operate. On May 7th, they encounter an American patrol. The Americans are suspicious, checking identities carefully, looking for SS tattoos that identify Waffen-SS members. Weidinger claims his men are Wehrmacht stragglers separated from their units. The Americans accept the lie or do not care enough to investigate. The Das Reich survivors are processed as regular Wehrmacht prisoners and sent to POW camps. Approximately 2,100 other Das Reich soldiers, caught by Soviet forces in the same time frame, are not as fortunate. The final accounting of Das Reich's war came gradually, assembled from fragmentary records and survivor testimony. Total casualties for the division across the entire war, approximately 60,000 killed or died of wounds. This figure counts only those officially reported and likely undercounts actual losses. The division was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, making precise accounting impossible. What is certain is that of the men who served with Das Reich at any point between 1939 and 1945, the majority died. The survivors carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Some became advocates for the division's memory, writing memoirs that emphasized combat achievement and minimized or denied crimes. Others lived in silence, never speaking of what they had done or witnessed. A few provided testimony for war crimes investigations, though these were the minority. Most survivors simply tried to forget, to build new lives in post-war Germany, to pretend the 12 years of the Third Reich had been someone else's nightmare, but Oradour would not let them forget. The preserved ruins stood as permanent accusation. Das Reich's legacy was fixed. They had fought brilliantly, they had murdered extensively. Both were true, both would be remembered. The division that had sought glory found infamy instead. They had proven themselves as Hauser intended, but what they proved was humanity's capacity for military excellence in service of absolute evil. That was Das Reich's final lesson. October 1st, 1946. Nuremberg, Germany. The International Military Tribunal courtroom. A Soviet prosecutor stands before the court, holding documents stamped with Das Reich insignia. He reads from a report dated August 1941, Minsk Operational Area, Security Cordon established per orders. Einsatzgruppe operations completed successfully, 920 hostile elements neutralized. The prosecutor looks up at the judges, 920 people, women, children, elderly, shot in a ravine outside Minsk. The document before you proves that the SS Division Das Reich provided direct support for Einsatzgruppe mass murder operations. This was not an isolated incident. This was institutional practice. The defense attorney objects, arguing that the document does not prove individual knowledge or participation by specific Das Reich members. The objection is noted. The prosecutor continues, building a case, document by document, witness by witness, photograph by photograph. By the time he finishes, the conclusion is inescapable. The Waffen-SS, including Das Reich, operated as a criminal organization. The tribunal will rule accordingly. The ruling establishes that membership in Das Reich after a certain date is itself evidence of criminal participation. Theoretically, any Das Reich veteran can be prosecuted simply for serving. In practice, the reality will be far more complicated. The legal framework for prosecuting Das Reich's crimes was established at Nuremberg, but implemented piecemeal and incompletely over decades. The International Military Tribunal declared the Waffen-SS a criminal organization in October 1946, creating legal basis for prosecuting members. But the prosecution of individual Das Reich veterans faced massive practical obstacles. Evidence was scattered, incomplete, or destroyed. Witnesses were dead or unreachable. Many perpetrators used false identities or disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. The Cold War created new priorities. Both East and West Germany needed soldiers and former soldiers for their new armed forces, making aggressive war crimes prosecution politically inconvenient. The result was selective justice. Some crimes prosecuted vigorously, others ignored, creating an inconsistent and ultimately unsatisfying legal reckoning. January 12, 1953, Bordeaux, France. The trial of 21 Das Reich veterans accused of the Oradour massacre begins. The defendants include 14 Germans and 7 Alsatians, men from Alsace who had been conscripted into Das Reich after Alsace's annexation by Germany. The trial becomes a political crisis in France. The Alsatian defendants argue they were forced conscripts, victims themselves of Nazi aggression. Alsatian political groups demand clemency, threatening secession if their countrymen are punished for German crimes. The trial proceeds amid massive publicity. Marguerite Ruffench, survivor of the church burning, testifies. Her words are devastating. She describes in excruciating detail the massacre of her daughter, grandson, and 450 others. She identifies defendants who participated in the church burning. The courtroom is silent except for weeping. When she finishes, the presiding judge calls a recess. Journalists report that several judges were visibly shaken. The trial resumes. Evidence is presented. German documents ordering the operation, survivor testimony identifying perpetrators, forensic evidence from the ruins. The case is overwhelming. The Bordeaux verdicts revealed the political complexities of punishing Das Reich's crimes. All 21 defendants were convicted on February 13, 1953. 14 received death sentences. 7 received prison terms ranging from 5 to 12 years. The verdicts created a political firestorm. Alsatian politicians threatened to boycott the French National Assembly. The regional government of Alsace demanded clemency for the Alsatian defendants. The French government, facing a potential constitutional crisis, intervened. On February 20th, just 7 days after sentencing, the French National Assembly passed an amnesty law specifically covering the Alsatian defendants. Their sentences were commuted. By 1956, all Alsatian defendants were free. The German defendants' sentences were also commuted. The death sentences became prison terms. The prison terms were reduced. By 1958, all defendants were free. Not one person convicted of the Oradour massacre served more than 5 years in prison. Not one was executed. The survivors felt betrayed. Marguerite Ruffenche, who had testified expecting justice, watched perpetrators walk free and said publicly, "France has no honor." The Soviet prosecution of Das Reich personnel followed a different trajectory. Soviet military tribunals tried approximately 180 Das Reich POWs between 1945 and 1952. The trials were held in closed sessions without Western observers, following procedures that did not meet international standards of due process. Defendants had minimal access to counsel, could not examine evidence against them, and faced judges who were instructed to impose severe sentences. The convictions were nearly automatic. 89 Das Reich veterans were executed by Soviet tribunals, most by shooting. 67 died in gulag camps from disease, malnutrition, or harsh labor conditions. The remaining prisoners were gradually released between 1953 and 1956 as Cold War tensions eased and the Soviet Union sought better relations with West Germany. The Soviet prosecutions were undoubtedly harsh and procedurally flawed. They were also, in many cases, prosecuting actual crimes that Western systems ignored. The case of Heinz Lammerding exemplifies the failure of post-war justice. Lammerding commanded Das Reich from January 1944 through the end of the war. He was directly responsible for ordering or authorizing the Toul hangings, was division commander during Oradour, though he did not personally give that specific order, and oversaw systematic war crimes across France and Eastern Europe. French authorities indicted him in absentia in 1953. A French military tribunal convicted him of war crimes in 1953 and sentenced him to death. Germany refused extradition. Lammerding lived openly in West Germany under his own name, ran a successful construction business, and died of cancer in 1971. He never spent a day in prison for his crimes. France protested German non-cooperation, but ultimately did nothing. Lammerding's freedom while his division's victims remained dead or traumatized encapsulates the inadequacy of post-war justice for Das Reich's crimes. German domestic prosecution of Das Reich veterans was minimal and late. West German authorities, initially reluctant to prosecute war crimes for political reasons, began systematic investigations only in the 1960s after public pressure in the Eichmann trial changed the political climate. Between 1960 and 1985, German prosecutors investigated 247 incidents involving Das Reich personnel. Of these, 67 resulted in charges being filed. 43 resulted in convictions. Sentences ranged from 18 months to life imprisonment, with most falling in the 2 to 8 year range. The investigations were hampered by statutes of limitations, destroyed records, and uncooperative witnesses. Many suspects had died before investigations concluded. The prosecutions that occurred, while legally important, came decades after the crimes and provided limited satisfaction to survivors or their families. The final documented execution of a Das Reich war criminal occurred in East Germany in 1952. An SS Unterscharführer named Karl Munch was convicted by an East German court of participating in the murder of 83 Jewish civilians in Ukraine in 1942. He was executed by guillotine on March 28, 1952. His conviction was based on testimony from 2 survivors of the massacre and documents found in captured German files. The execution received minimal publicity. Munch was 41 years old at his death. He had lived 7 years after committing mass murder. The survivors of his victims received notification of the execution, but no compensation, no apology, nothing but the knowledge that one man had been punished for crimes that involved hundreds of perpetrators. The statistical accounting of justice for Das Reich's crimes is damning. Documented war crimes involving Das Reich personnel, 247 incidents investigated by various authorities. Total Das Reich veterans prosecuted for war crimes, approximately 230, combining all jurisdictions. Convicted, 67 in Western systems, 180 in Soviet systems, totaling 247. Executed 89, all by Soviet authorities, still imprisoned as of 1960-17. Every defendant in Western custody was free by 1965. The most generous estimate suggests that approximately 3% of Das Reich personnel involved in war crimes faced any legal consequences. 97% never faced justice. They returned to civilian life, raised families, built careers, and died peacefully in their beds. Their victims died in burning churches, in mass graves, in concentration camps, in villages that no longer exist. October 1946, the Nuremberg tribunals ruling on criminal organizations. The judgment states, the Waffen-SS was directly involved with the persecution and extermination of the Jews, the administration of the concentration camp system, and the mistreatment of prisoners of war. The tribunal declares the Waffen-SS to be a criminal organization. This ruling should have opened the path for comprehensive prosecution of Das Reich veterans. Instead, it became a symbolic statement with limited practical effect. The ruling was legally significant but politically inconvenient. Cold War priorities, German reconstruction, and simple war wariness meant that comprehensive prosecution never occurred. The gap between the Nuremberg ruling and actual justice was vast. The ruling said Das Reich was criminal, justice should have followed. It largely did not. The victim's perspective on post-war justice is captured in testimony from the 1950s and 1960s. Survivors of Das Reich massacres, when asked about the trials and their outcomes, expressed consistent themes: betrayal, disappointment, and resignation. They had believed the civilized world would punish such crimes comprehensively. Instead, they watched perpetrators walk free, watched war criminals become prosperous businessmen, watched their testimony ignored or minimized. A Ukrainian survivor of a 1943 massacre testified in 1963 at a German war crimes trial. The defendants were acquitted for lack of evidence. She told journalists afterward, "I watched them kill my family. I identified them in court. They smiled at me." The judges said there was not enough proof. What proof do they need beyond my eyes, beyond my memory, beyond the graves? Her frustration was shared by thousands of survivors across Europe who found that justice for Das Reich's crimes was rare, delayed, and inadequate. The reckoning they sought never fully came. Some perpetrators faced consequences, most did not. The scales remained unbalanced. September 1957, Hamburg, West Germany, a reunion of Das Reich veterans, organized by HIAG, the Waffen-SS Veterans Organization. 380 men attend, ranging from former enlisted soldiers to senior officers. They gather in a beer hall decorated with division insignia, carefully displayed without the banned SS runes. The event opens with a moment of silence for fallen comrades. Then the speeches begin. A former regimental commander, now a successful businessman, addresses the assembly. "We served with honor in the greatest military formation of our generation. History has slandered us, calling us criminals for doing what any soldier does, following orders, fighting for our country. We know the truth. We were soldiers like any other, fighting against overwhelming odds, betrayed by politics and propaganda." The audience applauds. No one mentions Oradour. No one mentions the mass graves in Ukraine. No one mentions the executed POWs, the burned villages, the systematic participation in genocide. The division history being constructed in this room erases all of it, replacing documented crimes with a myth of military professionalism and victimhood. This sanitized narrative will dominate for decades, going largely unchallenged until historians in the 1980s and 90s systematically dismantle it with archival evidence. The post-war memory battle over Das Reich began immediately after the war ended and continues in different forms today. Former Das Reich members and Waffen-SS veterans organizations sought to rehabilitate the division's reputation by emphasizing combat achievements while denying, minimizing, or justifying war crimes. This revisionist project was remarkably successful for several decades, aided by Cold War politics that made former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS personnel valuable as anti-communist experts, by general public fatigue with war crimes, trials, and by the deaths of witnesses who could contradict the sanitized narrative. The veterans' version presented Das Reich as elite soldiers forced to fight a defensive war against Bolshevism, victims of Allied propaganda who were unfairly labelled as criminals. This narrative required ignoring massive documentary evidence, dismissing survivor testimony, and constructing elaborate justifications for documented atrocities. HIAG, the Mutual Help Association of former Waffen-SS members, became the primary vehicle for propagating the sanitized Das Reich narrative. Founded in 1951, HIAG claimed to be a charitable organization helping former Waffen-SS members reintegrate into society. In reality, it was a lobbying group seeking legal rehabilitation of the Waffen-SS and historical revision of its crimes. HIAG published books, pamphlets, and newsletters presenting Waffen-SS units, including Das Reich, as purely military formations that fought honorably and were unjustly persecuted after the war. By the early 1960s, HIAG membership included approximately 4,000 Das Reich veterans, making the division one of the best represented formations in the organization. These veterans produced their own division histories, memoirs, and unit newsletters. The common themes were consistent: emphasis on combat prowess, portrayal of Soviet enemies as subhuman aggressors, presentation of the Waffen-SS as defenders of European civilization, and near total silence on war crimes. The division histories published by Das Reich veterans between 1951 and 1989 reveal the revisionist project in detail. 12 major books were published by former Das Reich members or HIAG-affiliated authors. These books average 400 to 500 pages each. Coverage of combat operations, equipment, tactics, and biographies of decorated soldiers fills 90 to 95% of the text. War crimes receive, on average, 4 pages per book. Oradour is mentioned briefly, usually with the explanation that it was a tragic mistake caused by resistance provocation or false intelligence. The Eastern Front massacres are either omitted entirely or dismissed as alleged incidents, unsupported by reliable evidence. Soviet testimony is rejected as propaganda. Survivor accounts are characterized as unreliable or motivated by revenge. The documentary evidence, German records proving Das Reich's systematic criminality, is ignored or explained away as Allied forgeries or misinterpretations. The cumulative effect of these books was to create an alternative history where Das Reich was a heroic military formation, unfairly maligned by victors' justice. October 16th, 1969, Oradour-sur-Glane, French President Georges Pompidou dedicates the permanent memorial at the preserved ruins. Over 10,000 attend, including survivors, victims' families, and French resistance veterans. Pompidou's speech is uncompromising. These ruins stand as permanent accusation against those who committed this crime and all who would justify or minimize it. France will never forget. The world must never forget. The ceremony includes the unveiling of plaques listing the 642 victims by name, age, and relationship. The youngest, 8 days old. The oldest, 87 years. The memorial is designed to preserve the ruins exactly as Das Reich left them. The burned church, the destroyed homes, the skeletal remains of a murdered village. Over the following decades, approximately 300,000 people per year will visit Oradour. It becomes one of Europe's most powerful Holocaust and war crimes memorials, a permanent refutation of the sanitized narrative Das Reich veterans promoted. But even as Oradour stands preserved, Das Reich memorial stones appear in German military cemeteries, identifying the division only by its combat history. The Cold War paradoxically helped Das Reich veterans rehabilitate their reputations. West Germany, established in 1949 as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, needed experienced military personnel for its new armed forces. The Bundeswehr, established in 1955, many former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS officers were recruited, including Das Reich veterans. Their war crimes were overlooked or considered irrelevant compared to their anti-communist credentials and military expertise. Several former Das Reich officers served in senior positions in the Bundeswehr, including at least 2 who had commanded battalions during Oradour. Their presence in the new German military sent a signal: past crimes would not be prosecuted aggressively if the perpetrators were useful in the present. This cynical pragmatism extended to intelligence services, where former SS personnel were recruited by both West German and American agencies for their knowledge of the Soviet Union and communist movements. Das Reich veterans found employment, respectability, and protection from prosecution by making themselves valuable to Cold War West. The opening of Soviet archives in the 1990s revolutionized historical understanding of Das Reich's crimes. Soviet military intelligence and NKVD had documented German atrocities systematically during and after the war, creating vast archives of testimony, photographs, and captured documents. These archives were closed to Western researchers during the Cold War. When they opened in the 1990s, historians discovered extensive documentation of Das Reich war crimes that had been unknown or poorly documented in the West. Mass graves were located and exhumed. Survivor testimony that Soviet authorities had collected in the 1940s was made available. German documents captured by Soviet forces and held in Moscow archives proved systematic Das Reich involvement in genocide and mass murder. This new evidence made the veterans' sanitized narrative untenable for serious historians. Books published in the 1990s and 2000s by researchers like Christian Ingrau, Peter Lieb, and Helmut Sundermann established beyond doubt that Das Reich was both an elite combat formation and a criminal organization. The two characteristics were inseparable. The academic consensus that developed by the early 2000s is unambiguous. Das Reich was one of the most criminally culpable formations in the German military. The division participated directly in the Holocaust, committed systematic war crimes across multiple theatres, and developed an institutional culture that encouraged atrocity. This consensus is supported by overwhelming evidence: German military records, Soviet archives, Allied intelligence files, war crimes trial transcripts, survivor testimony, forensic archaeology of mass graves, and comparative analysis with other Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations. No serious historian disputes these conclusions, yet the sanitized narrative persists in certain circles. Neo-Nazi and far-right groups continue to lionize Das Reich as an elite force fighting for European civilization. Online forums and fringe publications recycle the HIAG narratives, presenting Das Reich as victims of Allied propaganda. These groups ignore the evidence or dismiss it as part of a historical conspiracy. The memory battle continues, though the historical truth is no longer in doubt. Contemporary neo-Nazi appropriation of Das Reich symbols reveals the enduring appeal of the sanitized narrative. Far-right extremist groups across Europe and North America use Das Reich insignia, photographs of the division's soldiers, and references to its combat record as symbols of white supremacy and fascist ideology. These groups deliberately strip away the historical context of Das Reich's crimes, presenting only the combat achievements and ideological commitment. Das Reich becomes, in this twisted usage, a symbol of warriors willing to fight for racial purity against overwhelming odds. The victims are erased, the crimes are denied or justified. The division's actual history is replaced by a fascist fantasy. This appropriation has made Das Reich symbols illegal in many European countries. Displaying the division's insignia can result in criminal prosecution in Germany, Austria, France, and other nations. Yet the symbols circulate online, in closed forums, in the visual language of contemporary fascist movements. Das Reich's legacy is weaponized by those who admire what the division represented. The museums and memorials documenting Das Reich's crimes serve as counter-narrative to the sanitized version. Oradour-sur-Glane in France receives 300,000 visitors annually. The Toul Museum of Resistance documents the Das Reich hangings. In Ukraine, memorials at Kharkov and numerous villages mark sites of Das Reich massacres. In Belarus, the Minsk Museum of the Great Patriotic War includes exhibits on German atrocities with specific documentation of Das Reich crimes. These institutions preserve testimony, display artifacts, and educate visitors about what Das Reich actually did. They exist because survivors, victims, families, and later generations refuse to let the crimes be forgotten or denied. The physical memorials ensure that no matter what narratives circulate in veteran reunions or neo-Nazi forums, the ruins of Oradour still stand. The graves in Ukraine still hold their dead. The evidence remains, preserved in stone and earth and institutional memory. May 1987, Hamburg, a HIAG regional meeting, much smaller than the 1950s gatherings. 63 Das Reich veterans attend, most in their 60s and 70s. The meeting opens with the usual ritual, moment of silence for fallen comrades. But the tone is different from earlier reunions. The men are aging, dying. The war recedes into history. A younger generation of Germans shows no interest in rehabilitating the Waffen-SS. The Federal Republic has officially acknowledged Germany's crimes. The sanitized narrative the veterans worked so hard to construct is failing. One veteran, a former Hauptsturmführer, speaks, "History has judged us harshly, perhaps too harshly. We did what we believed was right at the time. We cannot change the past. We can only hope that future generations understand we were soldiers, not monsters." But the historical record contradicts him. Das Reich veterans were both soldiers who fought skillfully and monsters who murdered systematically. The attempt to separate these aspects, to claim the military identity while denying the criminality, was always intellectually dishonest. As the Hayek generation dies, taking their sanitized narrative to their graves, what remains is the documented history. Das Reich will be remembered, but not the way the veterans hoped. August 14th, 1997, Oradour-sur-Glane. Robert Hebras, 72 years old, stands in the ruins of the barn where Das Reich soldiers shot his father and 189 other men on June 10th, 1944. Hebras survived by playing dead among the corpses, a bullet grazed on his arm, lying motionless for hours while the building burned above him. He escaped after dark and hid in the woods. He was 20 years old then. He has spent the 53 years since telling his story to anyone who will listen. School groups, journalists, historians, tourists, filmmakers. He estimates he has given his testimony over 2,000 times. Today he speaks to a French television crew making a documentary. The interviewer asks if it gets easier with repetition. Hebras shakes his head. It never gets easier. Every time I tell it, I see their faces. My father, my brother, my friends. I see the German soldiers walking among the bodies, shooting anyone who moved. I see the flames. I hear the screaming from the church where the women and children burned. No, it does not get easier. But I must tell it. I am one of the last who can. When we are gone, only the ruins will speak. I must speak while I can. The survivor testimony of Das Reich's crimes constitutes one of the most important historical records of the Second World War. Approximately 2,400 survivors across France, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and other countries provided formal testimony about Das Reich atrocities. These testimonies were collected at different times by different authorities. Soviet war crimes investigators in 1944 and 45, French authorities preparing for the Bordeaux trials, German prosecutors investigating crimes in the 1960s through 1980s, and academic historians recording oral histories before survivors died. The testimonies share common elements: the speed and totality of the violence, the lack of warning or explanation, the randomness of survival, and the ordinariness of the perpetrators. Survivors consistently describe being shocked not by monsters, but by normal-looking men who committed monstrous acts without apparent emotion. This banality of evil, to use Hannah Arendt's phrase, runs through the testimony like a thread. Marguerite Ruffin provided the most famous survivor testimony from Oradour. She was 47 years old on June 10th, 1944, when Das Reich soldiers locked her, her daughter, her grandson, and over 400 other women and children in the village church. Ruffin survived because she jumped from a stained glass window as the church burned and hid in bushes despite gunshot wounds. Her daughter and grandson died in the flames. Ruffin's testimony at the 1953 Bordeaux trial was devastating in its clinical detail. She described the moment of realization that the Germans were not conducting an identity check, but a massacre. When they brought the box into the church and lit the fuse, I knew. The women began screaming, clutching their children. The explosion came, fire everywhere. The smoke was choking us. I saw the window high in the wall. I climbed onto a pile of rubble and jumped. I heard machine gun fire. I felt bullets hit me. I fell into bushes and lay still. I heard the screaming until the fire consumed everything. Ruffin lived until 1988. She never fully recovered from her wounds or her trauma. The Ukrainian testimonies, collected primarily by Soviet investigators in 1944 and 45 and later accessed by historians after the Soviet archives opened, reveal the scale of Das Reich's Eastern Front crimes. A farmer named Petro Kovalenko witnessed the March 1943 massacre near Kharkov of 347 Jewish civilians. His testimony, given in July 1944, describes details that could only have been observed firsthand. The Germans, SS with the runes on their collars, arrived in trucks. They had the Jews dig pits in the forest. Then they shot them in groups. I was hiding in the trees, 200 meters away. I could hear the shooting for hours. Some Germans smoked cigarettes while they waited their turn to shoot. When it was finished, they buried the bodies with a bulldozer. The earth moved for hours afterward. Some were buried alive. Kovalenko's testimony was corroborated by forensic examination of the mass grave, which confirmed 347 bodies and matched his description of the execution method. Anna Dmitrievna Sokolova survived a Das Reich massacre in Belarus in August 1941. She was 16 years old when Das Reich Security Battalion surrounded her village, separated the men from women and children, and executed 93 men in a nearby field. Her father and 2 brothers were among the dead. Sokolova's testimony, given to Soviet investigators in September 1941, just weeks after the massacre, captures the immediacy of trauma. They made us watch. The women and children, they made us stand there while they shot the men. My mother tried to run to my father and they hit her with a rifle. We stood there crying and they laughed. After they shot everyone, they set fire to the houses. They took 14 girls from the village. I was taken. We were kept for 3 days. The things they did. Then they released us because the unit was moving. They told us if we spoke of this, they would return and kill everyone. I speak now because Soviet forces liberated us. The Germans cannot return. But I still see their faces. I will always see their faces. The testimony from Yugoslav survivors reveals Das Reich's earliest atrocities. A Serbian farmer named Jovan Petrovic witnessed the April 1941 massacre at Veliki Šiljegovac. His testimony, given to Yugoslav investigators in 1945, describes the collective punishment methodology that Das Reich would employ throughout the war. The German soldiers surrounded the village at dawn. They claimed partisans had attacked them nearby. This was a lie. There were no partisans in our village. They assembled all the men in the square, 59 of us. They separated 15 of the oldest and youngest, told them they could go. Then they marched the rest of us to a field. I thought they would question us, maybe take hostages. Instead, they set up machine guns. I realized what would happen. When the shooting started, I fell down before the bullets reached me. I lay under bodies. I was covered in blood, most of it not mine. When the Germans left, I crawled out. 47 men were dead. I was one of 12 who survived by pretending to be corpses. The women and children, they locked in the church and burned it. I lost my wife, my daughter, my son, all because Germans were ambushed 40 kilometers away. The common themes in survivor testimony create a composite picture of Das Reich's methodology. First, entire communities were held responsible for actions of individuals or actions that occurred elsewhere. Second, disproportionate violence. Minor provocations or even suspected provocations triggered massacres. Third, systematic planning. The massacres were not spontaneous outbursts, but organized operations with defined roles, equipment, and procedures. Fourth, documentation. Das Reich kept records, filed reports, documented the killings as routine military operations. Fifth, impunity. The perpetrators acted without fear of punishment, knowing their superiors approved or at least would not interfere. These patterns appear in testimony from France, Ukraine, Belarus, Yugoslavia, across all theatres where Das Reich operated. The consistency suggests institutional culture rather than isolated incidents. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Many suffered what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, depression, anxiety. Medical and psychological support was minimal in the immediate post-war period. Survivors were expected to resume normal lives, to rebuild, to move forward. Many could not. Suicide rates among Das Reich massacre survivors were elevated for decades after the war. A study of Oradour survivors conducted in 1975 found that 42% reported suicidal ideation, 31% had been hospitalized for psychological treatment, and none reported feeling fully recovered from the trauma. The massacre of June 10th, 1944, continued killing decades later through suicide, stress-related illness, and psychological breakdown. Das Reich's victims died not just on the days of the massacres but in the years that followed. The children who survived Das Reich massacres carried special burdens. They grew up without parents, without families, often without homes. Many were raised in orphanages or by relatives who themselves were traumatized. They reached adulthood shaped by violence they witnessed but did not fully understand. A woman named Marie Dupont survived Oradour as a 6-year-old child. Her mother died in the church burning. Her father was shot in the barns. She escaped because a German soldier, in a rare moment of mercy or caprice, pulled her from the church before it was burned and told her to run. She did not understand why she survived when her family died. In a 1983 interview, at age 45, she said, "For years I thought I must have done something wrong. Something that made God take my family but leave me. It was not until therapy in my 30s that I understood there was no reason. I survived by accident. They died by murder. But that understanding does not ease the guilt I feel for living when they did not. The testimony collection efforts by historians in the 1980s and 1990s occurred in a race against time. Survivors were aging, dying. Historians recognized that if testimony was not recorded immediately, it would be lost forever. Projects were launched to conduct video interviews, to record oral histories, to preserve the voices before they were silenced by death. Robert Hebras participated in dozens of these recordings. So did other Oradour survivors, Ukrainian survivors, Yugoslav survivors. The historians asked detailed questions. What exactly did you see? What exactly did you hear? Can you identify any perpetrators? Can you describe the sequence of events? The testimony was recorded, transcribed, archived. Some of this material was used in late war crimes prosecutions. More was deposited in archives for future historians. The survivors cooperated because they understood their voices were the last direct link to what happened. After they died, there would be only documents and ruins. The human connection would be severed. Robert Hebras died on January 14th, 2023, at age 97. He was the last living survivor of the Oradour massacre. His death was reported internationally. French President Emmanuel Macron issued a statement. With Robert Hebras, we lose not just a witness to history, but a guardian of memory. He devoted his life to ensuring that the massacre at Oradour would never be forgotten. Thanks to his testimony, it never will be. Hebras had given his final interview 6 months before his death to a French documentary filmmaker. In it, he said, "I have told this story thousands of times. To students, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. I did not do this because I enjoy reliving the worst day of my life. I did it because silence is complicity. If we do not speak of what evil men did, we allow them to erase their crimes. I spoke so that the 642 who died would not be forgotten. Now I am dying. The responsibility passes to you, to the living. Do not let them be forgotten. Do not let it happen again." His last words were a warning and a plea. The graves speak when the voices can no longer. At Oradour, the ruins stand as permanent testimony. In Ukraine and Belarus, mass graves continue to be discovered, decades after the war, as construction projects or agricultural work uncovers the dead Das Reich left behind. Each grave is evidence. Each skeleton is a witness. Forensic archaeologists can determine age, sex, cause of death. The bones tell stories. This person was shot from behind, execution style. This person was younger than 15. This person was pregnant. The physical evidence corroborates survivor testimony, proves what the sanitized narratives deny. The dead cannot be silenced by time or revisionism. They remain in the earth, permanent accusation against those who put them there. As the last survivors die and the last voices fade, the graves and ruins become the final witnesses. They will speak as long as anyone chooses to listen. The comparison is unavoidable and disturbing. Das Reich was one of the most tactically proficient formations in the Wehrmacht. By measurable military standards, kill ratios, mission success rates, operational flexibility, innovation under pressure, the division consistently outperformed peer units. At Kharkov, Das Reich's armoured tactics became case studies in combined arms warfare. At Kursk, the division's defensive operations demonstrated how inferior numbers could inflict disproportionate casualties through superior tactics. Even in defeat at Normandy and the Ardennes, Das Reich fought with a skill that Allied commanders acknowledged and feared. Soviet intelligence assessments identified Das Reich as one of the most dangerous German formations, recommending that Red Army units engage it only with numerical superiority of at least 3-1. By the cold mathematics of military effectiveness, Das Reich was elite. Simultaneously, by equally measurable standards, Das Reich was one of the most criminal formations in modern military history. Minimum 25,000 to 40,000 civilian deaths, directly attributable to the division. Systematic participation in genocide, institutional culture that encouraged atrocity. The question that haunts historians is not whether these two characteristics coexisted, the evidence proves they did, but what that coexistence means for how we understand military excellence, moral responsibility, and the nature of evil. The clean Wehrmacht myth has been thoroughly debunked by historical research over the past 4 decades. The myth held that the Wehrmacht fought an honourable conventional war, while the SS committed atrocities. This separation of military professionalism from criminality was always false, but Das Reich proves its impossibility with particular clarity. The division's combat achievements and its war crimes were not separate activities conducted by different personnel. They were integrated aspects of the same institutional culture. The ideological indoctrination that made Das Reich soldiers willing to massacre civilians also made them willing to accept suicidal casualty rates in combat. The command structure that planned brilliant armoured offensives also planned village destructions. The same officers who received Knight's Crosses for valour ordered mass executions. The same soldiers who fought courageously against armed enemies murdered unarmed civilians. Das Reich demonstrates that military effectiveness and moral depravity are not opposites, but can be mutually reinforcing within a sufficiently toxic ideological system. The question of individual choice complicates any simple moral accounting. Das Reich soldiers operated within a system designed to encourage atrocity. Ideological indoctrination from recruitment, orders from respected commanders, peer pressure from fellow soldiers, institutional rewards for brutality and punishment for dissent. But the evidence also shows that refusal was possible. Some soldiers did refuse to participate in executions and faced disciplinary action but not execution. Transfers were granted to soldiers who could not stomach the killing. The choice to participate was individual, even if the environment shaped that choice. This creates a moral complexity historians must navigate. Das Reich soldiers were not automatons. They made choices, often terrible choices, but choices nonetheless. Explaining the institutional pressures that produced mass participation in atrocity does not absolve individual perpetrators of moral responsibility. It contextualizes their guilt without erasing it. The Wehrmacht and OKH enablement of Das Reich's crimes implicates far more than just the SS. Wehrmacht commanders knew what Das Reich was doing. Liaison officers filed reports, protests were made, and nothing changed. Das Reich continued operating, continued committing atrocities, continued receiving supplies and support from Wehrmacht logistics. The German military establishment tolerated Das Reich's criminality because the division was militarily useful. When Wehrmacht generals needed a reliable formation to hold a critical sector, to spearhead a counterattack, to conduct a difficult operation, they assigned Das Reich despite knowing the division's methods. This tolerance was complicity. The Wehrmacht cannot claim moral superiority to the Waffen-SS when it consistently chose to work with, support, and benefit from SS formations whose crimes the Wehrmacht knew about and enabled. Das Reich's crimes were possible because the entire German military system, not just the SS, accepted criminality as the price of combat effectiveness. Allied commanders faced their own moral compromises regarding Das Reich. By 1944, Allied intelligence had extensive evidence of Das Reich war crimes. The Oradour massacre was known within days and publicized in Allied propaganda. But Allied forces needed German surrender and Japanese defeat, and those strategic priorities overrode war crimes concerns. When Das Reich veterans surrendered to American forces in May 1945, they were processed as regular POWs, not war criminals. Some were later turned over to French justice, but most were not. American commanders knew they were harboring war criminals, but made the pragmatic decision that processing hundreds of thousands of POWs was difficult enough without adding war crimes screening. This was strategically rational and morally questionable. Allied complicity in allowing Das Reich criminals to escape justice was not intentional conspiracy, but rather the result of competing priorities and limited resources. The effect was the same. Most perpetrators faced no consequences. Contemporary relevance of Das Reich's history lies not in direct analogies. There is no equivalent in modern Western militaries to an SS Panzer Division, but in the institutional lessons about how elite military culture and moral restraint interact. Das Reich shows that technical military excellence does not guarantee ethical conduct. Indeed, elite status can become a liability if it creates institutional arrogance and sense of exceptionalism that places the unit above normal rules. Modern military institutions must navigate this carefully. How to create units capable of exceptional performance without creating cultures that believe themselves exempt from legal and moral constraints. The mechanisms that prevented Das Reich's criminality existed in theory: military law, command oversight, humanitarian norms, but failed in practice because institutional culture overrode formal rules. The lesson for contemporary militaries is that culture matters more than regulations, that elite units require more oversight, not less, and that military effectiveness must be subordinated to legal and moral constraints, never elevated above them. The final accounting of Das Reich requires holding two truths simultaneously. Truth 1. Das Reich was an exceptionally effective military formation that demonstrated tactical and operational excellence across multiple theatres and years of combat. Truth 2. Das Reich was a criminal organisation that systematically murdered civilians, participated in genocide, and operated outside any legal or moral framework. Both truths are historically documented, both must be acknowledged. The temptation to emphasize one truth while minimizing the other must be resisted. Military historians who focus only on Das Reich's combat record while ignoring or downplaying its crimes are whitewashing evil. Moralists who acknowledge only the crimes while ignoring the military context miss important questions about how such evil became institutionalized in an effective organization. Complete history requires holding both truths, examining how they related to each other, and asking what that relationship reveals about the capacity of human institutions to channel human capabilities toward terrible ends. The German cemetery at La Carme, Normandy, contains graves of over 21,000 German soldiers, including hundreds of Das Reich dead. The graves are marked with simple crosses, name, and dates, nothing else. Visitors can walk among them, read the names, note the ages. Many were teenagers, many died on the same days, killed in the same battles. The cemetery is maintained by the German War Graves Commission, kept in dignified condition, accessible to the public. Nearby, just 30 kilometres away, stands Oradour-sur-Glane, the preserved ruins. Same war, same division, two memorials with radically different messages. La Carme memorializes soldiers who died, Oradour memorializes civilians who were murdered. Both are historically legitimate, both are necessary for complete understanding. The German soldiers at La Carme were individuals, many conscripted, many killed in combat against armed enemies, many who perhaps committed no personal crimes. They deserve the basic dignity of burial and remembrance, but they served in a criminal organization fighting for a criminal regime. That context cannot be erased by the pathos of young death. Oradour's ruins show what Das Reich actually was, what it actually did. The ruins are the counterweight to any attempt to memorialize Das Reich without acknowledging its crimes. The question of evil that Das Reich forces us to confront is whether evil requires abnormality or whether normal human beings, in the right circumstances, are capable of systematic atrocity. Das Reich soldiers were not psychopaths or sadists in higher proportion than the general population. Psychological evaluations of war criminals after the war consistently found them disturbingly normal. They were average men who committed extraordinary evil within an institutional system that demanded, rewarded, and normalized that evil. This is the terrifying lesson. Das Reich's crimes were committed not by monsters, but by people who, in different circumstances, would have been ordinary citizens, workers, fathers. The implication is that the capacity for such evil exists latently in normal human beings and can be activated by ideological indoctrination, institutional pressure, and dehumanization of victims. We want to believe that the men who burned Oradour's church were fundamentally different from us, that we would never do such things. The evidence suggests this comfort is false. Under sufficient pressure, in a sufficiently toxic institutional environment, many people are capable of participating in atrocity. This does not excuse the perpetrators, it warns the rest of us. The preserved ruins at Oradour-sur-Glane stand as Das Reich's permanent monument, though the division never intended such a memorial. The ruins are maintained exactly as Das Reich left them in June 1944. The burned church with its collapsed roof, the destroyed homes with rusted sewing machines and bed frames still visible, the cars riddled with bullet holes, the silence broken only by wind and footsteps. 300,000 people visit annually. They walk through the ruins, read the plaques, stand in the church where 452 people burned to death. The memorial conveys what words cannot: the totality of the destruction, the absence of the 642 who died. In the museum, visitors see photographs of the victims, families, children, ordinary people whose lives were ended by men who believed ideology justified murder. The ruins speak more powerfully than any historical text. This is what Das Reich was. This is what Das Reich did, not to soldiers in battle, but to civilians in a village that had done nothing. The ruins are the answer to every attempt to separate Das Reich's military achievements from its moral crimes. The achievements exist in combat reports and statistical analysis. The crimes exist in preserved stone and earth where bodies still rest. The historical verdict on Das Reich is settled among serious historians, though debates continue about specific details and interpretations. The division was simultaneously an elite combat formation and a criminal organization. Its tactical excellence enabled its crimes by providing mobility and access. Its ideological indoctrination motivated the crimes by teaching soldiers that mass murder was duty. The Wehrmacht's tolerance enabled the crimes by providing logistical support and asking no questions. Allied pragmatism allowed most perpetrators to escape justice by prioritizing victory over accountability. The Cold War rehabilitated some criminals by valuing their anti-communist credentials over their past. The historical record survived all attempts at revision through the preservation of documents, testimony, and physical evidence. What remains 80 years after Das Reich's destruction is a complete picture of how military excellence and moral depravity coexisted in a single institution, how normal men committed extraordinary evil, and how historical memory battles continued decades after the last shot was fired. Das Reich is remembered. But the memory is contested, fought over, claimed by different narratives. The neo-Nazis want the combat record without the crimes. The victims want the crimes acknowledged without military glorification. Historians try to present both, knowing that incomplete history serves neither truth nor justice. The ruins at Oradour resolve the argument. They stand regardless of what narratives circulate, regardless of what veterans claimed, regardless of political convenience. The ruins are permanent testimony. As long as they stand, Das Reich will be remembered not as the elite division its veterans wanted history to record, but as the criminal organization it actually was. Skilled killers who chose to kill the defenseless, soldiers who became murderers, an institution that proved military excellence is no guarantee of moral worth, and sometimes its opposite. That is Das Reich's legacy. That is what history will remember,